Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Endless Circle. It was a regular morning in Ohio, the kind of day that made you forget anything out of the ordinary could happen. The birds outside my window sang their usual tune, and the air was crisp with the promise of a pleasant winter day. But then I received the call. "Mike," my colleague's voice was shaky, "have you heard about the disappearances?" I wasn't sure what he was talking about. He didn't wait for me to ask. People are vanishing. One by one. No trace, nothing. It's like they never existed. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Disappearances weren't that uncommon, were they? People left, went off the grid, or made poor choices. It wasn't something to be afraid of. Still, I could hear the tension in his voice, something primal, the kind of fear you get when you know something you can't explain is happening. "Where? What's going on?" I asked. "They've started in the west side of town. First, there was just one, now it's like there's a pattern, spreading," he said. "And, Mike, you won't believe this, the last person who vanished, they were last seen in their own house. And there was a sound." I frowned, confusion setting in. "A sound? What kind of sound?" He didn't answer immediately, but I heard him take a sharp breath. "Like footsteps. But it wasn't just a sound. It was something else. Something that didn't belong." My mind raced. I knew this area. I knew these people. It wasn't possible. "Mike," he continued, "I think we're dealing with something we don't understand. Something bigger." I tried to shake it off. I had work to do. But his words stuck with me throughout the day. The thought gnawed at me, something dark and heavy settling in my chest. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My room, usually quiet, now seemed full of whispers. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside felt like it could be something else, something lurking. Something just beyond my vision. And then, I heard it. A soft shuffle. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, listening. The sound continued, rhythmic and faint, like footsteps, but I was alone. I had checked the house before bed. No one was supposed to be here. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked toward the door. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it, but the air in the room felt thicker, heavier. The footsteps were still there, getting closer. My pulse quickened as I realized they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from the hallway, from the very spot where I had just checked. I opened the door, my hand trembling, but there was nothing there. Only silence. A silence that felt unnatural. The kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me, and sank onto my bed, my mind spinning with the possibilities. Was it my imagination? Was it a prank? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The fear settled in. I wasn't alone. The following morning, I woke to more unsettling news. Another person had disappeared. Same circumstances. Same eerie footsteps. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to look. Something was happening. And the more I tried to make sense of it, the more the world around me seemed to shift, to slip out of focus. Every time I thought I understood what was happening, something new would occur. Something unexplainable. The more I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for all of this, the more I realized there wasn't one. Every theory I came up with felt weak, like a frail barrier trying to keep back something far stronger than I could comprehend. I couldn't deny the creeping sense that I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape. By the third disappearance, the panic in town was palpable. People were locking their doors, not just at night, but during the day. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was a serial kidnapper, others whispered about some kind of paranormal force. But no one had concrete evidence. No one had any idea what was really happening. I decided to visit the scene of the latest disappearance. The house was eerily quiet, a typical suburban home, the kind that could belong to anyone. I stood outside, staring at it. There was nothing unusual about it. The blinds were drawn, the yard neatly trimmed, like any other house on the block. But there was something wrong. The air was thick with a strange stillness, and I could hear my own breath too clearly, too loudly. I walked around the perimeter, looking for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. That's when I heard it. A faint sound. The kind you only notice when everything else is silent. The unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. But there was no one there. I froze, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps came from inside the house, though I could see no one through the windows. It was the same sound I had heard in my own home. The same pattern. A rhythmic shuffle that seemed to echo through the very walls. My legs felt heavy, like they were cemented to the ground. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but something held me in place. I had to know. I crept closer to the door, my body tense, every nerve screaming at me to turn around. The sound of the footsteps continued, but now it felt as if they were circling me. As if they were coming closer, from all directions, from inside the house and from the space beyond it. My breath quickened, my hand shaking as I reached for the door handle. It turned easily. Too easily. Inside, the air was colder than I expected. My breath fogged the air in front of me. The house felt abandoned, but I knew it hadn't been. The television was still on in the living room, muted, showing some old sitcom. There was food on the kitchen counter, half-eaten, as if the inhabitants had just left. But there was no sign of struggle. No sign of anything unusual. Then I heard it again, the shuffle of footsteps, now louder, clearer. And then the faintest whisper. Help me. I spun around, heart racing. There was nothing. Just empty space. My mind screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. I needed to understand what was happening. I walked down the hallway, the footsteps echoing in time with my own. The house seemed to stretch before me, growing longer and darker. The rooms all felt the same, dim, silent, and unsettling. I reached the bedroom door. It was cracked open, but I couldn't bring myself to open it further. Instead, I stepped back, almost instinctively, feeling the urge to leave stronger than ever. As I turned, I heard the sound of the door creaking open behind me. Slowly, relentlessly. The footsteps inside were growing louder, closer. I bolted for the front door, my breath ragged, but the door slammed shut in front of me, as if something was holding it closed from the other side. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. I was trapped. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls shrinking, the air thick with something ancient. And then, in the distance, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a door opening somewhere else in the house. But I wasn't alone anymore. The chill in the air grew colder still. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, the panic rising. I had to get out. I had to escape. I shoved against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows around me seemed to grow, pulling closer. And then I saw it, a figure in the hallway, standing just out of reach of the light. Tall, impossibly still. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me. I turned, smashing my shoulder into the door. It didn't give, but I heard something else. A whisper. A breath. It came from behind me, and I turned, but nothing was there. The footsteps started again, coming closer, closer, as if the house itself was alive and hunting me. I could feel the pressure building, the sound of my heart drumming in my ears. Desperation clawed at me as I twisted the doorknob again. And then, suddenly, the door flew open. I stumbled outside, gasping for breath. The world outside seemed impossibly quiet, too still. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. It felt like a different world, one where time had stopped, where nothing made sense. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. But they weren't behind me anymore. They were in front of me, circling, moving in and out of my vision, like some unholy dance. I was trapped. The endless circle had begun. I ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the street, but no matter how fast I moved, the footsteps followed. They weren't just behind me anymore, they were everywhere. The rhythmic shuffling moved in perfect sync with my own steps, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing. No figure. No form. Just shadows flickering in my peripheral vision, as if the darkness itself had become alive. I didn't stop running until my lungs felt like they might explode. I stumbled into an alley, pressing myself against the cold, rough brick wall, trying to catch my breath. Sweat drenched my clothes, and I could still hear them. Those footsteps. They were getting louder now, like they were closing in on me from every direction. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the panic down. It's just in your head, I told myself. This isn't real. But I could feel it, something was wrong. So wrong. The alley, the street, the world itself felt distorted, like I was seeing through a fog. The buildings around me loomed larger, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. I could hear the sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the far-off voices of people, but they all felt distant. Like I was listening through a wall, unable to reach them. Why am I so alone? The thought crept into my mind unbidden. Why do I feel like there's no one left? I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. The footsteps were still there, just out of sight, but unmistakable. I turned quickly, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the house standing right behind me, but there was nothing. The alley stretched on, longer than it should have been. The more I moved through it, the more I realized the path was twisting, changing shape. I've been here before, I thought. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. I had walked down this very alley countless times. But now, it was different. There were no other exits, no way out. The walls closed in, the air thick with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. I tried to turn back, but I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. The alley was shifting around me like it was alive, and I couldn't find my way back to the street. I froze, staring down at my feet. The gravel crunched under my shoes, but there was something wrong with the sound. It wasn't right. It wasn't real. It echoed, distorted, like something else was making the sound with me. I looked up, my breath catching. In the distance, I saw it. The figure from the house. It was standing at the end of the alley, just out of reach of the dim streetlight. Its features were obscured by shadows, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Come closer." I didn't want to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't obey. Slowly, reluctantly, I took a step forward. The air around me grew colder with every movement, and the footsteps, those terrible, relentless footsteps, began to echo louder. My own, and the ones that weren't mine. "Help me." I froze, looking around desperately. It was impossible. I had heard those words before. In the house. But they couldn't be here. Not now. Not in this place. I tried to move again, to turn and flee, but the ground beneath me seemed to ripple. The alley shifted again, stretching and warping, becoming a dark tunnel that closed in on me. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Why can't I escape? I thought desperately. Why is this happening to me? The sound of my heartbeat grew louder, louder than anything else, drowning out everything around me. I reached out for the walls, my fingers grazing the rough brick. It felt solid, but also not. As if the structure of the world itself was bending. I felt sick. The world was closing in. I could feel the figure getting closer now, moving silently, gliding toward me. The whisper came again, louder this time. "You can't escape." My breath came in short gasps. I looked down at my feet. The gravel, it was gone. I was standing on smooth stone, the ground beneath me suddenly slick and wet. Where did it go? Where am I? And then I saw it, the circle. A faint outline of light, swirling, twisting at the end of the alley. It was like a doorway, but nothing I had ever seen before. It pulsed, softly at first, like it was breathing. I felt a pull toward it, a compulsion to move closer, but I didn't want to. I could see shapes moving in the light. Shadows. Figures. Faces. I couldn't make out who they were, but they were moving, swirling, shifting, trapped in the same strange limbo I had found myself in. Am I dead? I thought. Is this where they go? The figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating, pressing me closer to the circle. It wasn't just watching me now. It was inside me, crawling under my skin, filling my mind with a single, horrible truth. There was no way out. I turned toward the circle. My body moved on its own, my feet dragging me forward, closer to the light. I was no longer in control. The footsteps, the whispers, the ever-present weight of the figure behind me, it all faded. All that remained was the pull of the circle. I stepped into it. When I crossed the threshold of the circle, everything changed. The world around me collapsed into darkness, and for a moment, I thought I had simply ceased to exist. My mind was empty, utterly blank, no thoughts, no sensations. Just an overwhelming, crushing weight of nothingness that swallowed me whole. But then, slowly, reality began to return. I felt solid ground beneath my feet again, but it wasn't the smooth stone or the wet gravel I had been standing on. It was something else, something wrong. It was soft, like grass, but the texture was unfamiliar. The air was thick, damp, and heavy, pressing down on me like I was submerged in some unseen force. I blinked, trying to focus, but when I opened my eyes, I found myself back in the same alley. The same dim streetlight flickered in the distance. The same dark shadows lurked at the edges of my vision. The sound of the footsteps, my footsteps, echoed in my ears, but they didn't stop. I looked down, and the gravel beneath me was back. I was standing in the exact same spot I had been before, only now everything felt off. It was like I was seen through a veil, like the world had been distorted somehow. I turned around, my heart racing. The figure was still there, standing in the same spot it had been before, its outline just visible in the shadows. But this time, I saw something I hadn't seen before, a dark, almost invisible line stretching from the figure to the center of the alley, pulling me toward it. I stepped back, but the ground beneath me didn't allow it. Every direction I turned, every movement I made, the circle, the same pulsating circle of light, followed me. And the footsteps? They never stopped. The weight of panic crushed me. I was trapped. I had crossed the threshold, but I hadn't escaped. This wasn't a new place. It was the same place, but it had changed. Time, space, they no longer meant anything. I couldn't even trust my senses. Every time I looked away and looked back, the world shifted, bent out of shape, like a broken mirror trying to reflect a reality that didn't exist. I felt my chest tighten, my breathing growing more frantic with each passing second. The circle of light in front of me was growing bigger now, expanding, consuming the entire alley. The whispers began again, softer at first, but growing louder, merging with the sound of the footsteps, until they became one. The words were clearer now. You cannot leave. My legs shook beneath me. This was it. I couldn't escape. This wasn't a house. This wasn't an alley. This wasn't even a real place anymore. I was trapped in something that defied logic, something that broke the very laws of nature. It was like the world itself was looping around me, dragging me deeper into a nightmare where time was meaningless. I reached for the walls again, hoping for something solid, but they felt thin, like paper. They bent as I touched them, stretching outward as if they weren't even real. I pushed against them harder, trying to find an edge, something to anchor me to the world I knew. But nothing worked. The world was shifting, bending, rewriting itself. I couldn't make sense of it. The figure was closer now. It was no longer in the shadows. It was standing right in front of me, taller than I ever remembered, the silhouette looming like a specter. The face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes, cold, empty, alive. You've been here before. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My blood ran cold. I remembered those whispers. The footsteps. The dark figure. This wasn't the first time I had been here. I had been here before, but I couldn't remember when. A sick realization crawled up my spine. The circle. The alley. The figure. It wasn't new. It was a cycle. A never-ending loop that I had fallen into, one that I couldn't escape. Every step I took led me right back to the beginning. Every time I thought I was moving forward, I ended up right back where I started, in the circle. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my skull. There's no way out. I turned again, desperate to break free, but the circle followed me. The world around me was folding, bending. I was walking, but somehow, I wasn't moving. Every direction I went, the footsteps echoed, louder and louder, until they were all I could hear. And then, the truth hit me harder than anything else had. I wasn't alone. I wasn't just hearing the footsteps of myself. I was hearing the footsteps of the others, those who had vanished. Those who had been trapped here before me. Their echoes, their voices, their fears, they were all part of this endless loop, a circle that never stopped. And now, I was one of them. I collapsed to my knees, my hands shaking. There was nothing I could do. No way out. You are one of us now. The voice came from all around me, not just the figure, but from the air itself. The walls, the shadows, the ground beneath me, it all whispered together. A chorus of voices, distant and close all at once. I looked down at my hands. The skin was pale, almost translucent. My fingers trembled as I reached for my face, but it didn't feel like my face anymore. It felt wrong, hollow, like someone else's. A scream built in my throat, but it didn't escape. The circle of light pulsed again, pulling me forward, dragging me deeper into its grip. And then, I understood. This wasn't a place. It wasn't a time. It was a trap. I had become part of the endless circle, and there was no escape. Time had no meaning anymore. The moments stretched on, uncountable and formless. I could feel myself slipping, fading, becoming something less than human. I wasn't just stuck in this nightmare, I was the nightmare. My body, my mind, were becoming part of this endless loop, like so many before me. The whispers surrounded me, growing louder, faster, until they filled every crevice of my mind. You are one of us. The voice echoed again, and this time, I knew it wasn't just in my head. The alley had vanished. The circle had swallowed me whole, transforming everything around me into a vast emptiness. The light that had been so terrifying was gone, replaced by an oppressive blackness, one that felt alive and hungry. I had become a part of it. And I felt it, the heavy weight of the others, of everyone who had been here before. They were with me now, their presence lurking beneath the surface, always there, always watching. I could feel them in my bones, their voices a constant hum in the back of my mind. I was no longer an individual. I was a part of the endless cycle, the unbroken chain of souls trapped in this twisted place. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't move. The breath was gone from my lungs, replaced by the cold emptiness that filled every part of me. I had no body, no form, no identity anymore. I was a prisoner in my own mind, cursed to relive the same moments over and over again. And then, I saw it. At the edge of my vision, there was another figure, a shape. A dark silhouette, just like the one that had followed me before. But this one was different. It didn't move like the others. It was still, standing at the edge of the black void, watching me. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It was a reflection of what I had become, a part of the endless circle, a part of the dark. It wasn't a person anymore. It was the manifestation of the cycle itself, the very force that kept us trapped in this hellish loop. It was me. I reached out toward it, desperate to understand, to break free. But as I moved, the figure moved with me, always just a step behind, always mirroring my every action. There was no escaping it. This is it. This is who I am now. This is all I will ever be. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I could feel my mind unraveling. The cycle wasn't just about physical space, it was about time, about existence itself. Once you were pulled in, there was no escape. The circle didn't just trap your body. It trapped your soul. It replaced you. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me completely. We are all one. I looked down at my hands again, the fingers now twisted, longer, as if they weren't my own. I felt my face, and it was no longer my face. The skin had faded, replaced with something colder, smoother, like glass. My reflection, myself, had been swallowed by the circle, consumed by the endless loop of disappearances. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was too far gone. I was no longer a person. I was just another echo, another shadow in this place. And then, I heard it, the footsteps. Not just mine. Not just the ones that had followed me. But the footsteps of everyone who had ever disappeared, everyone who had ever crossed the threshold and been consumed by this place. The footsteps were coming from all directions, overlapping, blending together into a singular, terrifying sound. They were all around me. The circle had swallowed them all, and now it was swallowing me. I turned, and I saw it. The light. The circle. It was getting smaller, closing in on me. But this time, it wasn't just the circle I saw. It was the faces of the others, the faces of the lost ones, staring at me through the darkness. Their eyes were wide with terror, their mouths open, but no sound came from them. They were all trapped, just like me. And then, the circle pulsed once more. There is no escape. The words were clear now, undeniable. The circle was a prison, and I had become part of it. There was no way out. I was lost, we were all lost. As the circle closed in around me, the last thing I felt was the crushing weight of nothingness. The figure, my reflection, moved toward me. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was reaching for me. Its cold fingers brushed against mine. And then, silence. The footsteps faded. The light disappeared. And the circle closed. The dark mirror. It started with a question. What if everything you thought you knew about yourself wasn't true? I didn't believe in fate. I didn't believe in things like destiny or premonitions. I was a man of reason, a man who dealt in logic, who had spent years studying the practicalities of life, rejecting superstition and anything that smacked of the unknown. Yet, the moment I laid eyes on that mirror, something inside me shifted. It was an antique, inherited from my grandmother's estate in Virginia, a heavy, ornate thing with a dark, gleaming surface. I barely noticed it while I was clearing out the house, but something about it drew me in. The frame was silver, etched with intricate patterns, curling around the glass like a vine that had grown wild over time. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to find tucked away in a dusty corner of a forgotten room, rather than in a place of any real significance. It was late in the evening when I first stood before it, barely noticing how the light from the single lamp above cast strange, elongated shadows against the walls. I was tired, but something compelled me to take a closer look. I had no idea why I'd never noticed it before. The mirror seemed out of place in that dim, musty room. The air around it felt colder, almost damp. I gazed into the reflection, expecting to see just myself, my tired face, my unkempt hair, the worn-out clothes I had been in for days. But when I looked closer, something was wrong. The reflection wasn't exactly the same as I had expected. It wasn't just me standing there anymore. The mirror began to show things that weren't in the room with me. At first, it was subtle, a flash of movement, a shadow passing by. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light. But then, the images grew clearer. I saw a woman in the reflection, a woman I didn't recognize. She stood in the corner of the room, her back to me. She was looking directly into the mirror, but her face was obscured. I could see her hair, dark and matted, hanging like a curtain around her head. She was still, her body rigid, but there was an overwhelming sense of sadness in her posture. I stepped back, confused. I was alone in the room. I looked again, but she was gone. The mirror only reflected my own image. I breathed a sigh of relief, chalking it up to fatigue. But then, as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, cold breeze flowing from the direction of the mirror, though the window was shut tight. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder at the mirror one more time. Nothing. Just my reflection. But that feeling, that coldness still lingered. I tried to dismiss it. I tried to convince myself I was just tired, that maybe I'd been seeing things. After all, it was an old mirror. The glass could have warped with age, causing strange reflections. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something just beyond the glass. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the images from the mirror kept haunting me. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's face and the deep sadness that filled it. It felt like she was calling to me, like she was trying to tell me something. I tried to push the thought from my mind. I was overthinking it, I told myself. But as I drifted into a fitful sleep, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft, slow scraping sound like nails dragging across glass. I jolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I looked around the dark room, but there was nothing there, nothing except the soft rustle of the wind outside. Yet, that scraping sound, the noise from the mirror, lingered in my mind. The next day, I found myself drawn to the mirror again. I don't know why I went back to it, why I felt compelled to stand before it once more. But as I stared into its depths, I began to see things that weren't supposed to be there. The woman, yes. But now, her face was clearer. She was crying. And in the reflection of her eyes, I saw something else, a faint shadow moving behind her. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared, the more real it became. The shadow was a figure, a man, tall and dark, his face hidden beneath a hood. He was standing just behind her, watching. His hands, pale and thin, were reaching toward her, slowly, like a predator closing in on its prey. The woman didn't notice him. Her gaze remained fixed on the mirror, on me. I wanted to look away, to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like I was paralyzed, trapped by the reflection. And then, the man moved. I gasped, my heart racing. He wasn't in the mirror anymore. He was in the room. I whirled around, expecting to see him standing right behind me, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Silent. I turned back to the mirror. The woman was still there, but the shadow had disappeared. She was alone once again. My breathing quickened. I wanted to get away from the mirror. I wanted to destroy it, to rid myself of whatever hold it had on me. But I couldn't. The more I tried to look away, the more I found myself drawn to it. It was as if the mirror was pulling me in, showing me things that didn't belong to the present, things that were yet to come. But I had no way of knowing what would happen next. Those reflections hadn't stopped. And I knew, deep down, that I was being shown something I couldn't escape. The following days were a blur, filled with restless nights and mornings marked by a growing sense of dread. I couldn't escape the image of the woman in the mirror, her tear-streaked face haunting me at every turn. And that man, the shadowy figure that had lurked behind her, he had been in the room with me. I knew it. I felt it. Yet, every time I turned around, he was gone. I couldn't stop myself from returning to the mirror. Something inside me, something deep and primal, urged me to look again. But I didn't want to. I was terrified. What if I saw something even worse this time? But I went anyway. That evening, I found myself standing before it once more. The room was dark, save for the soft, flickering light from the single bulb above. My hands trembled as I reached for the edge of the mirror, as though I could touch the reflection itself, feel its coldness seeping into my bones. And then it began again. The woman appeared. She was sitting now, her back hunched, her hands folded in her lap. Her face was buried in her palms, as though she were crying. Her sobs were so soft I could barely hear them, but I felt them. The weight of her sorrow pressed on my chest, suffocating me like a vice tightening around my ribs. But this time, there was something different. As I stared at her, the air in the room grew heavy. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I shivered, but I couldn't look away. In the reflection, her sobs grew louder, and I saw the shadow again. The man. He wasn't just standing behind her now. He was moving toward her, his hands outstretched, his fingers reaching for her throat. I gasped. The fear that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound escaped me. My mouth was dry, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside me. The man was so close to her now. His hands were mere inches from her. I knew what was coming. I could feel it. Then, the woman's head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto mine. Her gaze was full of terror, but there was something else, something desperate. She was trying to warn me. But before I could react, the figure behind her made his move. His hands closed around her neck, and she let out a silent scream. I turned away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I had to get away from this place, from this cursed object that was showing me things that were never supposed to be seen. But when I looked at the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The shadowy figure was standing in the doorway. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. His face was hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, like icy daggers piercing through my soul. I backed away slowly, my heart thundering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place by an invisible force. Then, the figure stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. He was tall, impossibly tall, and his steps echoed in the room, each one louder than the last. With every movement, the air grew colder, heavier, as if the very space around me was bending, warping. He was coming closer. I tried to speak, to plead with him, but my voice was gone. No words would come. I was suffocating, my throat tight with fear. The figure reached out. His fingers were pale, almost ghostly, and they hovered just inches from my face. I could feel the chill emanating from them, like the touch of death itself. Then, I heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper, like a cold wind curling through the room. It was the woman. Her voice was distorted, faint, but unmistakable. "You can't escape." The figure's hand moved closer, brushing against my cheek. The touch sent a jolt of terror through me, and I stumbled backward. But as I moved, something strange happened. I felt myself falling, not physically, but mentally. The room around me seemed to twist, the walls bending and warping like the reflection in the mirror. The air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I turned back to the mirror, desperate to find a way out, but the image in the glass had changed again. The woman was no longer there. Instead, I saw myself staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. And the man, he was behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders, his cold breath brushing against my neck. I gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. The mirror. It wasn't just showing me visions of the future. It was showing me what was already happening, pulling me deeper into its nightmare. "You can't escape." The voice echoed again, louder this time. It was no longer the woman. It was the figure. The man. "You were already mine." I was trapped. Trapped in their reflection, trapped in this twisted reality where time no longer followed any rules. The mirror was not just a window into the future, it was a prison. And I was its prisoner. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged, my chest heaving with terror. The room felt smaller, more oppressive, as if the very air around me was closing in. I could still feel the coldness of the figure's fingers lingering on my skin, despite the fact that he wasn't there. The chill spread through my body, seeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. The mirror was no longer just a reflection, it had become a doorway, a portal that was pulling me deeper and deeper into its sinister grip. I had to get away. I had to break free. But where was the escape? The very room I was in seemed to twist, to bend, as though reality itself was unraveling at the edges. I turned and ran, not knowing where to go, only knowing that I had to get as far from that cursed mirror as possible. But no matter how fast I moved, no matter how many corners I turned, I couldn't escape its pull. The air seemed to thicken, as though it were tangibly resisting my every attempt to leave. And then, I heard it again, the whisper. Low, guttural, like the murmur of a distant storm. It was everywhere. In the walls. In the floor. In my mind. "You can't run. You can't hide." I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there. No figure. No shadow. Just the empty room. But the feeling, the presence, was overwhelming. It was as though the air itself was alive, pressing in on me from all sides. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the doorframe, the reflection of the mirror appeared. It wasn't just showing the room anymore. It was showing something else. Something darker. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing in my throat. The glass flickered, like a faulty television screen, and then the image cleared. The woman. She was back, but this time she was different. Her face was contorted in agony, her hands pressed against the glass as if she were trying to break free from whatever held her inside. I reached out instinctively, wanting to help her. But as my fingers brushed against the surface, the mirror began to distort. The glass rippled like water, twisting and warping, and suddenly, I wasn't standing in front of it anymore. I was inside it. I gasped, pulling my hand away in panic. The room I had been in was gone. The walls dissolved, leaving me in a dark, shifting void. The air was thick with the sound of low whispers, like 1,000 voices murmuring at once. The temperature dropped, and I could feel my skin prickling with cold, though I couldn't see a single source for it. There was only darkness, blackness so deep that I couldn't tell where the space around me began or ended. I looked around, but the darkness didn't shift. It was as though I was standing in an infinite space, where time and distance had no meaning. "You're here now," a voice whispered, its tone thick and distorted, almost too low to hear. It was the man's voice. I knew it instinctively. I wanted to scream, to fight, but the sound wouldn't come. My throat was tight, as though something invisible was squeezing the breath from my lungs. I was suffocating. My legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unyielding. My heart pounded, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed, trapped in a place where even the passage of time didn't seem to exist. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness. Not the man. Not the woman. Something else entirely. It was a shape, a silhouette, shifting and writhing, as if it were made of smoke or shadows. It was vast, its form stretching and bending in impossible ways, as though it existed in every corner of this void simultaneously. I couldn't look away. The figure moved toward me slowly, impossibly slow, and as it did, I felt the very essence of my being shrinking. The more it advanced, the smaller I felt, as though it was absorbing my very existence, pulling me into its shape, melding me with the darkness. I tried to scream again, but this time, no sound came. My mouth opened, but it was as though the very air had turned to lead, suffocating me, rendering me silent. "You are mine," the voice rumbled again, but it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus now, dozens of voices, all speaking in unison, all carrying that same, chilling tone. The figure was inches from me now. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, smothering me, and I knew that if it touched me, I would cease to exist. "You are already part of it," the voice whispered. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. I was going to be consumed. I was going to disappear into the mirror, into this endless void. My mind raced, but there was no escape. No way out. The walls of this place were closing in, growing tighter and tighter, until there was nothing left but me and the shadow. But just as I thought it would swallow me whole, I felt something, a flicker of warmth. A crack of light, piercing through the darkness like a beacon. For a moment, the blackness shuddered, as if it was afraid of that light. I didn't think. I didn't question. I reached for it. And just like that, the void shattered. The mirror's surface rippled again, and I was back in the room. My body collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my chest heaving with the effort to breathe. The world around me was normal again, bright, full of light, steady. But something was different. The air was still thick with tension. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker. I looked at the mirror. The woman was still there, her face twisted in agony, her eyes pleading with me. And behind her, the man was waiting. I had escaped the void, but I had not escaped the mirror. And I never would. I could no longer deny it. The mirror was no longer just an object in my house. It was a living thing, a creature that fed on my fear, that twisted and contorted my mind. It was slowly pulling me into its world, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left of me except a reflection. I tried to move on, tried to ignore it. I left my apartment, stayed with a friend for a few nights, but the thoughts haunted me. The image of the woman, the cold grip of the man, the black void where I had almost been swallowed alive. They wouldn't leave me. One night, exhausted from the constant cycle of dread and uncertainty, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. I didn't even remember walking into the room. It was as though the mirror itself had called to me, a silent siren song that tugged at my soul. The woman's face appeared almost instantly, her wide, pleading eyes locked onto mine. But this time, I wasn't paralyzed. This time, I moved closer. I couldn't help myself. The draw was too strong, too overwhelming. Her lips trembled. She mouthed something, but no sound came from her. Her hands were pressed against the glass, but I couldn't understand her. Was she trying to warn me? Begging for help? Or was it something else entirely? My heart pounded as I placed my hand against the mirror, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers. I could feel the faintest vibration in the glass, like a heartbeat, steady and insistent. Suddenly, the air shifted. The room grew cold. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. My skin prickled, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, grow longer. I turned around, but the room was empty. There was no one there. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was suffocating. And then the man appeared. He wasn't in the room, not physically. He was in the mirror, standing right behind the woman. His hands were stretched out toward her again, but this time he didn't hesitate. His fingers closed around her throat with a sickening slowness. The woman's face contorted in pain, but there was no sound. No scream. Just her silent, helpless struggle. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something in me wanted to look away, to run, but my body refused to obey. The terror paralyzed me. My heart raced, pounding in my ears. I could feel the cold air around me thickening, like a storm gathering, preparing to break. "You can't save her," the man's voice echoed through the room. It was a low, guttural whisper, as though the words came from everywhere and nowhere at once. His fingers tightened on her throat, and I saw her eyes begin to lose their light, the last breath slipping away. She was fading. Her face grew pale, her lips blue, and then she collapsed against the glass, her body limp, lifeless. But the man didn't stop. His hands lingered, pressing deeper, as if savoring the moment, the life being drained from her. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "You're next," he whispered. I recoiled, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. My feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. The man's gaze bore into me, unyielding, unrelenting. I tried to look away, but his presence consumed me. The reflection was no longer just an image, it was a world, and I was trapped in it. The shadows around me deepened, grew longer, and I could hear a low, rumbling sound, like the distant growl of a storm. The mirror seemed to pulse, like a living thing, its surface rippling, bending, stretching. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. The room was still empty. My breath came in short gasps as I scanned every corner, every crevice. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. And then I saw it. In the reflection, I saw my own face, pale and distorted with fear. But behind me, standing in the doorway, was the figure. The man. His eyes gleamed with cold malice, his mouth curled into a twisted smile. "You can't escape," he said, his voice a hiss. I turned and ran. My heart was in my throat, my legs weak beneath me. I didn't know where I was going, I just had to get away. I had to escape. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled out into the hallway. The silence of the apartment building pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. I had to leave. I had to get as far from the mirror as possible. But as I ran, I felt the weight of the darkness closing in around me. The world around me seemed to warp, the walls bending and shifting, like they were part of the mirror itself. I turned a corner, and I saw it again, the figure. He was waiting for me, just ahead, blocking my way. His face was now visible, but it wasn't the same face I had seen before. It was distorted, twisted, as though it were made of shadows, shifting and changing with every passing second. And then, his voice. Low, cold, and final. "You're mine." I tried to scream, but no sound came. I reached for the door behind me, but it was too late. The man reached out and grabbed me. His touch was freezing, his grip unyielding. I felt my body go cold, my heart slowing as his presence enveloped me, drowning me in darkness. I was pulled back into the mirror. I couldn't move. The moment his fingers touched me, the world around me shattered. Everything dissolved into a thick, inescapable fog of shadows and cold. The mirror was no longer a mere reflection, it was a prison, a realm that had claimed me, body and soul. I tried to scream, to struggle, but my limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The air around me felt like ice, suffocating my every breath. His grip was unyielding, cold as death itself, and I could feel my life force slipping away, draining into the void. "You belong to me now," the man whispered, his voice like the rasp of dry leaves against a window. It was a finality in his tone, an unspoken truth. I was no longer in the world I knew. I was inside the mirror. Inside the dark, endless place where time and space ceased to matter. I wanted to fight. I wanted to claw my way out, but the power of the mirror held me fast. My eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The shadows closed in, pressing against me, suffocating me, until all that remained was the man and his chilling, malevolent presence. I could see him clearly now. His face was no longer distorted, no longer the shifting mask of shadow. It was a face I knew well. It was the face of the figure I had seen in the reflection, the face of the one who had haunted me, who had guided me into this nightmare. But his eyes were not human. They were endless black voids, hollow and empty, reflecting nothing but the darkness around us. The same darkness that was now swallowing me whole. "You think you can escape the future?" he hissed. His voice echoed through the void, reverberating in every corner of my mind, filling every inch of space. "You cannot. It is written in the glass." The mirror was more than just a reflection. It was a recorder. A prophet. It had shown me the future, the past, and now it was showing me my final moments, moments that had already been decided. I was nothing more than a spectator in my own life, a victim of forces beyond my control. And then, the woman appeared. She was there again, her face pressed against the glass, her body limp, lifeless. Her eyes were still pleading, still searching for help that I couldn't give. But this time, she wasn't just a reflection. She was part of it. Part of this world. You could have stopped it, her voice echoed, faint and distant, as though it were coming from the depths of a well. You could have saved us both. I wanted to cry out to her, to apologize for not understanding, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, choked with fear and despair. I was trapped. Trapped in the mirror. Trapped in this endless, suffocating void. I tried to reach for her, to touch the glass, to find some way to break the curse. But as my hand neared, the glass rippled, distorting her image, twisting her form until she was nothing more than a blur, a shadow in the dark. The man's grip tightened around my wrist, his fingers digging into my flesh, and I felt myself being pulled deeper, further into the darkness. You are mine now, he repeated, his voice a cold, final command. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no escape. There had never been an escape. I was part of it now. Part of the mirror. Part of the darkness. The future, the past, everything was written. And I was trapped in its reflection forever. The world around me began to distort, the edges of reality blurring, warping, until nothing remained but the man's empty, endless eyes staring back at me. I could feel my body fading, the last remnants of my existence slipping away, absorbed by the mirror, consumed by the very thing I had tried to escape. And then, all that was left was the darkness. No sound, no light, no time, just the endless, suffocating void. The end of reflection. The last sunset. It was supposed to be just another evening in Florida. The sun had set behind the horizon, casting a warm glow over the palm trees and the beach, but something felt wrong. I couldn't quite place it at first, just a subtle shift, like when you know you've forgotten something but can't remember what it is. I stood on the porch of my small house, looking out at the street, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of evening, children playing, dogs barking, the hum of distant traffic, had all faded away. The air felt still, as if the world was holding its breath. Just tired, I muttered to myself, rubbing my eyes. Long day. But even as I tried to dismiss it, the unease gnawed at me, growing with each passing moment. I glanced down the street, but the familiar landmarks were becoming blurry in the fading light. The houses seemed to warp and stretch, their outlines becoming indistinct, like they were melting into the shadows. I took a deep breath and stepped off the porch, deciding to take a walk around the block to clear my head. The pavement was warm beneath my feet, but there was an odd thickness to the air that made it feel heavier than usual. As I walked, I began to notice more subtle things, the streetlights flickering, the trees swaying despite the absence of wind, and the silence, the absolute, suffocating silence that seemed to weigh down on the entire neighborhood. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the longer I walked, the more I began to feel that I was no longer in the place I knew. The streets, the houses, they were all becoming unfamiliar, as though they had shifted without me noticing. The world around me was warping, bending, changing in ways I couldn't explain. A flash of movement caught my eye, and I turned instinctively, expecting to see a neighbor or a stray animal. But there was nothing there. just the oppressive darkness closing in on me. The shadows felt alive, pulsing with an eerie energy as if they were watching me. The unease turned into dread. I spun on my heel and started walking faster, my steps echoing too loudly in the empty street. The silence had deepened, almost suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I could hear my own breath, ragged and uneven, and the sound of my footsteps grew louder, as though the ground itself was amplifying every movement. Then, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper carried on the wind, but there was no wind. It came from behind me, faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer. A voice. A low murmur, indistinct, but full of dread. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It came again, closer this time, almost as though it was right next to my ear. "You're not where you think you are." I whipped around, my eyes darting through the darkness, but I saw nothing. Just empty streets. Just shadows. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I wasn't alone. There was something out there, something in the darkness. I began to run, not caring where I was going, just desperate to escape that voice, that feeling of being watched. My feet pounded against the pavement, but the faster I ran, the farther the street seemed to stretch. The houses blurred past me, their once familiar facades now twisted and distorted. The air was thick, pressing down on me, and I could feel the world closing in, tightening around me like a noose. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. I stumbled, tripping over something that wasn't there, and fell hard onto the ground. My hands scraped against the pavement, the pain barely registering as I tried to push myself up. The world was spinning now, the edges of my vision darkening. It felt like I was being pulled into something, a vortex of darkness that was swallowing everything in its path. I forced myself to my feet, gasping for air. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the street, illuminated by the faint light of a flickering street lamp. It was tall, its form shifting and changing, like it wasn't quite solid. Its features were obscured by shadow, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unfeeling. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure took a step forward. "You are not where you belong," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind, reverberating in the air around me. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I realized this was not my world. I was trapped in something else, something far worse than I could comprehend. The figure's shape flickered again, distorting like a mirage until it seemed to stretch and fade into the very air itself. I was alone again, but the feeling of being watched, of being lost in some alternate reality, stayed with me. The darkness, thick and suffocating, seemed to pulse around me as though it was alive. And then the lights went out. Everything went black. When the lights went out, the world around me seemed to collapse. It wasn't just the streetlights. It was everything, the house I had walked out of, the trees lining the street, even the distant outline of the horizon, all swallowed by a thick, impenetrable blackness. I blinked, trying to clear the darkness from my vision, but nothing changed. It was as if the world had shifted entirely, leaving me suspended in a void. The silence was deafening. No crickets, no wind, no sounds of life, just a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed against my eardrums. For a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. Maybe this is just a nightmare, I thought. I'll wake up, and everything will be fine. But then I heard it again, the whisper. It came from nowhere, yet everywhere. It was the same voice from before, low and hushed, but this time it felt more insistent, as if it were pushing into my mind. "You don't belong here," I gasped, my pulse racing as the words echoed through the darkness. Panic surged through my chest. I wasn't dreaming. This was real. And whatever it was, whatever force had pulled me into this twisted version of reality, wasn't going to let me go. I began walking, my feet uncertain on the ground. The street, once so familiar, was now foreign to me, warped and strange. I had no idea where I was going. I had no idea what to do. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Where is everyone? Where's the sound of traffic? Why is it so still? The more I tried to make sense of it, the more I felt like I was slipping further away from reality, like each thought, each question I asked myself was another step deeper into a void where no answers existed. I had to find someone. Anyone. But as I stumbled down the street, I realized there was no one. The houses, those same houses I had walked past 100 times, were now completely lifeless, windows dark, no signs of life within them. Even the street, which had always been lined with parked cars and the occasional dog, was empty. It was as if the entire town had disappeared, leaving me alone in a place that felt as though it was crumbling around me. I stopped, breathing heavily, trying to steady my nerves. "Stay calm," I told myself. "Think clearly. There's got to be a way out of this." I turned around, looking behind me to see if there was any sign of life, but it was only the same oppressive void. And that's when I noticed it, the faintest glimmer of light, far down the street. It was dim, flickering, but it was there. I wasn't sure why, but something told me I needed to go toward it. Without thinking, I began walking faster, my steps echoing against the pavement in the silence. As I neared the light, I saw that it came from a storefront window, one that looked strangely familiar, almost like the kind of place I would have passed every day without ever really noticing. It was a small, old shop with a faded sign that I couldn't quite read. The glass of the window was cracked in places, and the faint light inside flickered erratically, casting strange shadows against the walls. My heartbeat quickened. What is this place? I approached cautiously, pressing my hand against the cool glass of the window. Inside, I could make out shapes, human shapes, moving slowly, as if they were suspended in time. The people inside were all turned away from me, facing the back wall, their heads down, their bodies unmoving. The air inside the store was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were alive, shifting with a will of their own. I stepped back, instinctively recoiling from the sight. My hand dropped from the window, and I stumbled backward, tripping over something. I didn't know what it was, some kind of object lying in the middle of the street, but as soon as I hit the ground, I felt an overwhelming pressure, as though something had just shifted within me. The whisper came again, louder this time, no longer a distant murmur, but a sharp, jagged voice that sliced through the silence. "You are not alone, but you are not with them either." I jumped to my feet, eyes wide, scanning the street around me. The voice felt like it was inside my head, like it was echoing through every fiber of my being. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. A force. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming heavier with each breath I took. My chest felt tight, and the very ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble. The darkness pressed in, closer, colder, as though the world was trying to swallow me whole. I had to get out of here. I had to escape. I turned to run, but as I did, the ground beneath me cracked open with a sharp, sudden noise. The earth itself was splitting apart, and in the gap that appeared, I could see nothing, just a black void swirling with a malevolent energy that beckoned me to fall in. I stopped, frozen in terror. What the hell is happening? The whisper came again, this time more insistent, more forceful. There is no way out. There is only the descent. I backed away slowly, my mind reeling. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't explain it. All I knew was that I was no longer in my world. This place, the place I had walked in every day, was gone. The rules, the boundaries, the very fabric of reality had fractured, leaving me lost in something else. Something far worse. I could feel it now. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. And it was getting closer. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that I had to escape the growing darkness that seemed to consume everything in its path. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadows followed. They were always there, just out of reach, closing in on me, wrapping around me, tightening like a noose. Where was I? I thought, what was this place? And the whisper that followed me, cold and haunting, was the only answer I would ever get. You have already arrived. The world spun around me, the street, the houses, everything blending into one endless nightmare. I don't know how long I ran. The darkness seemed endless, stretching out in all directions like a labyrinth with no exit. My lungs burned with every breath, my legs ached from the effort, but I couldn't stop. Every corner I turned led to another identical street. Every step I took seemed to carry me further into this twisted version of reality. I was running in circles, trapped in an endless loop of night and shadow. The whisper didn't stop. It was a constant presence, threading through my thoughts, weaving itself into my mind. Every time I thought I had outrun it, it grew louder, clearer, as though it were right next to me, breathing down my neck. It will not let you go. The words echoed through my mind like a broken record. I tried to block it out, but the more I fought it, the stronger it became. Why? I asked myself. Why is this happening? What is this place? I stumbled again, this time falling to my knees, my hands scraping against the rough pavement. The ground felt different now, like it was no longer solid beneath me. I could feel it shifting, moving, as though it had a life of its own, reacting to my every step. I pushed myself to my feet, desperate for something, anything, that might help me make sense of this nightmare. But the more I looked, the less I recognized. The houses around me had started to warp, their windows becoming dark, their doors twisted, the shapes of the buildings stretching unnaturally, as though they were being pulled by invisible forces. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just a few feet away, cloaked in shadow. At first, I thought it was another trick of the light, an illusion created by the shifting world around me. But as I stared at it, I realized it was real. It was a person, or something that looked like one. Tall, impossibly still, with its face hidden in the darkness. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its presence, cold, suffocating, like the air itself had thickened around it. I backed away instinctively, my breath quickening. Not again. Not now. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. It was like it was studying me, waiting for something. My heart raced. What did it want? Why was it watching me? I was about to turn and run again when the voice came, softer this time, but unmistakably close. You're already part of it. There's no going back. I froze. The words didn't make sense. What did it mean? Part of what? I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my body frozen in place. The figure shifted, taking a step toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, and I thought for a moment that I might pass out. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though every breath I took was drawing me deeper into something I couldn't understand. "The world you know is already gone," the figure said, its voice low, almost a hiss. It was a sound that seemed to crawl under my skin, making my hair stand on end. "This is your reality now. Your descent has already begun." I shook my head, trying to push away the overwhelming panic rising in my chest. "No. This can't be real. This can't be happening." The figure stepped closer, and I felt an intense cold wash over me, like a sudden gust of icy wind. It touched my skin, chilling me to the bone. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped in place, paralyzed by fear. "Look around you," the figure said, its voice a twisted mockery of comfort. "This place, this world, is no longer yours. It is ours now." I turned my head, my eyes scanning the street once again. The houses were no longer just warped, they were breaking apart. The walls cracked and split, the windows shattering into 1,000 pieces, only to reassemble moments later into something else, something darker, something wrong. The streets twisted, folding into themselves, and the sky above me was no longer the soft, comforting shade of twilight. It was a deep, unnatural black, swirling with dark clouds that moved as if alive. I could feel the ground beneath me vibrating now, the entire world trembling as though it were on the verge of collapse. And then I understood. This wasn't just a place. It was a prison. A prison that had been created, warped, and broken to trap me here. To trap all of us. I had been brought here, whether by force or by some unseen power, and now I was part of it, part of this fractured reality where the laws of nature no longer applied. Where time no longer made sense. Where the shadows held power, and the air itself was alive with the whispers of things that should never exist. "There's no escape," the figure whispered, its voice now a cold, insistent hiss in my ear. "Not for you. Not for anyone." I opened my mouth to speak, to shout for help, but no words came out. My throat was dry, constricted by fear. My mind raced, desperate for an answer, for something to make sense of the chaos around me. But there was nothing. The figure took another step forward, and as it did, the world seemed to bend around it, the darkness folding in on itself. I could feel the edges of reality starting to fray, the boundaries between this world and whatever else was out there growing thinner with every passing second. "Welcome to your new home," the figure whispered, and with those words, I felt at the point of no return. I had crossed over, and now I was trapped in this endless void, lost in a reality that was not mine. And I could feel it now. The finality of it. The descent into madness. There would be no waking up. This was my reality now. This was where I would stay. Forever. It's hard to describe the feeling of being trapped in a place that isn't real. It's like drowning in something solid, each moment, each thought, weighed down by an overwhelming sense of loss. The world around me was no longer just strange. It had become a nightmare, an alien landscape that bled through the cracks in my mind, and I couldn't stop it. It felt like I was no longer just experiencing it, I was becoming part of it. I tried to move, to escape, but the air itself seemed to press against me. The streets, the buildings, the sky, they were all alive, pulsing with a rhythm that was not mine. It wasn't like a dream, where you know it's temporary. No, this was different. This felt permanent, as though my mind had broken and remade itself to fit this twisted version of reality. The figure, the thing that had spoken to me, was gone. But I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. Its words echoed in my head like a constant drumbeat. "This is your new home." I shook my head, trying to force the thought away, but it clung to me. The city had become a place where the laws of nature had ceased to apply, where time and space no longer made sense. The streets twisted and contorted, leading me in endless circles. Nothing felt familiar anymore. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, broke the silence. I turned, heart racing. There was no one there. I couldn't even say for sure if the sound was real or just another trick of the mind. But the footsteps came again. Closer this time. I took a step back, eyes scanning the empty street. Every corner, every shadow, felt alive with something I couldn't explain. My breath caught in my throat. Was it real? Was it following me? I had to know. I couldn't stay here, not knowing. With shaky legs, I forced myself to move forward toward the sound. Each step felt heavy, as though the ground itself was trying to hold me in place. The footsteps stopped. I stopped. A few seconds passed. Silence. Then the sound of breathing, soft, labored, but unmistakably there. I turned slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. And there it was again, the figure. This time, it was closer, standing at the edge of the street. Its form was more distinct now, its silhouette sharper, yet still shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting the space between us, like the world itself was bending to its will. I froze, unable to look away. My legs trembled, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. But I couldn't run. Something inside me knew that running wouldn't help. It would only make it worse. The figure stepped forward again, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to lurch, as though the very earth was pulling me toward it. The air grew thick, heavy with an oppressive presence. "You've already crossed the threshold," it said. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, direct, like the ringing of a bell in the dead of night. "This place has claimed you. You cannot leave. Not now." I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't form. My throat was dry, my body shaking with a fear I couldn't control. I had to get out of here. But I knew, deep down, that there was nowhere to go. The figure stepped closer still, until it was almost within reach. Its form rippled, as if it were made of smoke or liquid, its outline shifting with every movement. And then, I saw it, its hand, extending toward me, fingers long and unnaturally thin. I recoiled, taking a step back, but the figure's hand followed. It moved toward me with a speed that didn't make sense, like time itself had stopped for it and only for it. The cold from its touch seeped into my skin, making my entire body go numb. "We are all part of it now," it said, its voice low, almost intimate. "You cannot escape." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to find some shred of reason, something to hold on to. But the words echoed in my mind, each one carving itself deeper, until I couldn't tell where my own thoughts ended and the figure's voice began. It was right. There was no escape. The hand, no longer just a hand but a force, an entity, gripped my arm. The coldness of it spread through me, not just touching my skin, but sinking into my very bones, freezing my insides. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. I tried to pull away, but my limbs wouldn't obey. The figure's grip was tight, unyielding, like it was pulling me into something darker, deeper. And then everything went still. The world stopped moving. The sounds of the streets, the pulse of the air, the feeling of the ground beneath me, all of it vanished. There was only the figure, only the cold, only the silence. For a long moment, I felt nothing. And then, the vision shifted. The city around me began to dissolve, fading into a blank, endless void. The streets, the buildings, the sky, they were all gone. And in their place, there was nothing. Just darkness. I didn't know how long I stood there, in that void, but when I finally opened my eyes, I was somewhere else. Somewhere colder, darker. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, its gaze. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. And as I looked around, I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity that there was nowhere to hide. There was no safety. There was only the darkness, the weight, the crushing certainty that this was my new reality. There was no escape. There was no hope. There was only the descent. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air in the dark void felt thick, suffocating. Every inch of my body screamed for air, for release, for anything that might let me escape this nightmare. But there was no escape. There was nothing but the void. It pressed in from all sides, filling my thoughts, drowning out any hope I had left. I tried to focus, to force myself to wake up from this strange, twisted dream. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a dream at all. The absence of time, of space, it was all so real, so final. I was no longer just trapped in this place. I was becoming it, losing myself piece by piece. "This is where you belong," the voice echoed again, though the figure was nowhere to be seen. Its words filled the void, reverberating through me like a deep, mournful bell tolling. "You crossed the threshold, and now you are one with it." I wanted to scream, to shout, to beg for anything to make it stop. But my voice had long since failed me. The darkness pressed on my chest, and I felt myself sinking deeper into it, swallowed by something that wasn't just a place, but a state of being. There was no light, no sound, just the crushing silence and the ever-present weight of the figure's words. "You cannot leave." The words repeated over and over, each one like a hammer against my skull, slowly eroding any sense of reality I had left. Was this it? Was this what it felt like to lose yourself entirely? To be consumed by something so vast, so unknowable, that even your thoughts couldn't escape its pull? I could feel my mind fraying, the edges of my consciousness slipping away like sand through my fingers. Each thought, each memory, was dissolving, as though they never existed in the first place. I tried to hold on, to cling to anything that felt real, but everything around me melted away. The streets, the people, the sun that had once set in the sky, it was all gone. Just me, alone, in the dark. The silence stretched on, and I felt myself becoming something else, something formless, something that no longer needed to think or breathe or feel. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A glimmer. At first, it was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. But it grew, slowly, until it was undeniable, a light, a crack in the darkness. I didn't know where it came from, or how, but it was there. A thin line of light cutting through the black, like the first sign of dawn after an endless night. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Could this be the way out? Was it possible that there was still something beyond this endless void? I stumbled toward it, or at least I tried to. My limbs were stiff, as though my body had forgotten how to move. But I pushed through it, reaching out toward the light, toward the only thing that seemed to offer a chance of escape. As I neared it, the light intensified, bathing everything in its cold, white glow. It felt like I was walking through glass, the air around me hardening, breaking apart with each step I took. I could feel the weight of the darkness pulling at me, fighting me, but I refused to stop. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the light. And then, everything stopped. The world, if you could still call it that, folded in on itself, collapsing into the light. It was no longer a city, no longer a void. It was nothing but a blinding, searing light, consuming everything in its path. I felt it consume me too. But even as the light grew brighter, I didn't feel pain. No. I felt nothing. My body, my mind, everything about me was dissolving into the light, becoming one with it, merging with it in a way that felt inevitable. And just before I was completely engulfed, before the light took everything from me, I heard the figure's voice once more, softer now, almost like a whisper. This is your new reality. Welcome to the end. And then, there was nothing. The city beneath the water. I had always heard the stories. Stories about towns and cities in Louisiana that simply disappeared, swallowed up by the water, with no trace left behind but the faintest ripple across the surface. But I had never thought much about it until now. Until it was happening to me. It started small. A quiet shift in the air, the kind of thing you might notice out of the corner of your eye but dismiss just as quickly. The water level around the town of Bellefontaine had been rising for weeks, creeping over the edges of the levees, threatening to swallow the streets. People had started to pack their bags, evacuating as the storm season approached, but something felt different this time. I stood on the porch of my grandmother's house, the water lapping against the wooden steps. The house was old, worn, and had weathered many storms, but this felt different. There was an eerie stillness to the air. The birds, which would usually be squawking in the trees, were silent. Even the rustling of the wind had stopped. The water didn't feel natural either. It was too still, too thick, like something was hiding beneath it. "Hey, Ethan." My cousin, Claire, called from across the yard, her voice breaking through the silence. "You coming inside? It's getting late." I glanced at her, and for a brief moment, I saw something strange. Her face, no, her entire presence seemed to flicker. As though she was momentarily not there. Just an image, an illusion. I blinked, and she was standing still in the same place, her arms crossed in frustration. "You all right?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange feeling. "Yeah, just lost my train of thought." I turned to the water again, staring into the ripples that seemed to dance just beneath the surface, like shadows beneath a fading light. "Ethan, come on," Claire pressed, her voice tinged with urgency. "The storm's almost here, and I don't want you standing around in the dark when it hits." I nodded absent-mindedly, stepping inside the house, my feet leaving wet marks on the floor. The air inside was cooler, but it didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a cage, closing in slowly. When I turned to look back at the door, I thought I saw something, a fleeting silhouette out the window. A shape moving in the water. I squinted, but when I focused, it was gone. I shook my head again, trying to dismiss the feeling that I was slipping into something beyond my control. That night, the storm did come. But it wasn't a storm I had ever seen before. There was no thunder, no lightning. Just the relentless sound of the water rising, inching closer to the house, sweeping through the town with the quiet precision of something ancient. And as the floodwaters began to surge, I felt a strange pull, a force urging me to follow them. Sleep never came that night. The house creaked and groaned as if it was alive, reacting to the water that seemed to want to consume it. I kept hearing things, voices, whispers in the walls. The sound of a faint laughter that didn't belong to anyone in the house. Every now and then, I could swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to flicker and change, much like Claire had earlier. The storm lasted until morning, but when I stepped outside, the scene that greeted me was beyond anything I had expected. The town was gone. The water had risen, flooding everything in its path, but there was no sign of Bellefontaine. No houses, no trees, no familiar streets or sidewalks. It was as if the town had never existed. I stood at the edge of what used to be our neighborhood, staring out at the empty expanse of water. The sound of the waves crashing against the remnants of the levee echoed in my ears, but it wasn't the sound that bothered me. It was the stillness that followed. There was nothing. No signs of life. No trace of the people who had lived here, not even a piece of wood or broken glass from the homes that once stood. And yet, the water wasn't new. It had the same murky green hue, the same faint undertone of oil. It was the same as it had always been, only now it stretched farther than it ever had before, creeping into places that hadn't been affected by the floods in years. Ethan, where are you? Claire's voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned around, and there she was, standing just behind me. But something was wrong. Her clothes were soaked, as if she had been standing in the water for hours, yet the sky above was clear. The storm had passed, but she looked different. Her face seemed almost unfamiliar. Claire? I called, my voice shaking. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gave me a strange look, her eyes flickering. The water lapped gently at her feet, but she didn't move. Why didn't you listen? She asked, her voice not quite right. It was distorted, like a memory being played back on a broken tape recorder. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. What do you mean? Her expression faltered for a second, then returned to that strange, unfamiliar look. This place, it's changing, Ethan. And you're a part of it now. You can't leave. The words hit me like a wave. They made no sense, yet they felt like a warning, one I couldn't ignore. Where is everyone? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her face twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a smile I recognized. It was something darker, something wrong. You'll see them soon enough, she said, her voice trailing off into the air, as if the words themselves were slipping into the water, leaving only their hollow echoes behind. I turned back toward the water, my mind racing, my heart pounding. What had happened to the town? Where had everyone gone? And as the water gently moved beneath me, I realized with a sickening certainty the city wasn't gone. It was just waiting. The city beneath the water was not done with us. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a boundary. The water, the town, none of it felt right. It was as if we were no longer in the same place we had been yesterday, or even in the same time. The silence was unbearable, and every step I took on the wet ground felt like an intrusion into something that shouldn't have been disturbed. Where are the others? I asked again, my voice barely rising above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the nightmare even worse. Claire didn't answer. She simply stood there, her clothes still soaked through, her eyes blank and unblinking, staring into the distance. I tried to approach her, but my feet sank slightly into the muddy earth, as if the ground itself was rejecting me, pulling me deeper. "Claire?" I said, louder this time, stepping closer. Her head snapped toward me, and for a second, her eyes flashed, like a mirror breaking and shattering. But just as quickly, the flicker disappeared, and the cold expression returned. "You don't understand, do you?" she asked, her voice hollow, distant. I stepped back. The fear began to creep back into my mind, each moment stretching out, turning everything around me into an unfamiliar, alien landscape. What had happened to us? What had happened to the world? What's happening to this place? I asked, my voice trembling. Claire didn't respond. She simply turned and started walking away toward the town that had once been Bellefontaine. The water lapped at her feet but didn't seem to touch her. The town, no, the remnants of it, lay ahead, a vague silhouette in the distance. The buildings were no longer standing. There was only the wreckage and the water endlessly rising. I followed, unsure of what else to do. A part of me wanted to run, to escape, but my legs felt heavy, as though something was holding me in place. The town was gone, and yet it wasn't. It was as if it had been erased, but the echoes of it remained. And so we walked, Claire ahead, me behind, through a place that felt both familiar and wrong. As we reached the edge of the water, something caught my eye. A reflection. It wasn't in the water itself, but rather in the air above it, shimmering faintly, as though the air itself had turned into glass. I saw shadows move within it, figures of people I couldn't recognize. They looked like they were living, moving through the streets of Bellefontaine, as if the town still existed, but only in this distorted reflection. I blinked, and the image vanished, replaced by the ripples on the surface of the water. Had I imagined it? Or was it something else? Claire stopped in front of me, her gaze now fixed firmly on the water. She didn't seem to notice my confusion. She only stood there, staring at the same spot, her feet planted firmly in the mud. "Do you see them?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "See who?" I replied, straining my eyes. "The ones who are lost," Claire said, her voice sounding distant, like it came from far away. "The ones trapped in the water." I looked harder, trying to discern the shapes in the water. There were no faces, no bodies, just the faint outline of something. An impression of movement. And then, I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, like a voice coming from beneath the surface. It sounded like a name. My name. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. What was happening? Claire turned to face me now, her expression unreadable, almost as though she had become a different person entirely. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice cold. "But you are already a part of it. You've always been a part of it." I shook my head, feeling the panic surge within me. No, I'm not. This isn't real." The water swirled around us, its surface rippling violently for just a moment before it settled again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something beneath the water. A low hum filled the air. It was a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before, a constant, pulsing vibration that seemed to resonate deep within my chest, in the very bones of the earth beneath my feet. It felt like a warning, but also like something calling, beckoning. I looked at Claire again, but this time I saw something else in her eyes. A flicker of recognition, a flicker of understanding, but not one that brought comfort. "You have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time since I'd seen her. "You have to get away before it takes you." "Before what takes me?" I asked, barely able to breathe. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The hum grew louder, resonating through the ground beneath us. I turned, but I couldn't move fast enough. The water seemed to surge toward me with impossible speed, the earth beneath my feet giving way, the ground trembling as though the world itself was about to collapse. Before I could react, the water surged over me, and everything went black. The world around me shifted. One moment, I was submerged in the cold embrace of the water, and the next, I was standing in the middle of the street. Bell Fountain was there again, just as it had been, intact, as if nothing had happened. But the air was thick with the sense of something wrong. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the very fabric of reality had folded in on itself, and I was stuck in the middle of it, lost between dimensions. My reflection, my real reflection, appeared in a window. I could see myself standing there, staring at the version of me that wasn't me. My eyes were wide with terror, my face pale and gaunt, as though I had been through something far worse than any storm. And then I understood. Bell Fountain hadn't disappeared. It had been waiting for me. The realization hit me like a thunderclap, a sudden jolt of clarity cutting through the fog of confusion. Bell Fountain hadn't vanished. It was never gone. It was simply waiting. Waiting for me, or perhaps for anyone who dared venture close enough to be caught in its twisted grasp. I looked around, and everything felt wrong. The buildings, while intact, seemed too perfect, too clean, as if they had just been constructed and yet had aged beyond recognition in the span of mere minutes. The sky overhead was an unnaturally dim shade, not quite dark, but not light either. It wasn't the sky I remembered from before, if I could even trust my memories anymore. I took a few hesitant steps down the street, my feet moving without thinking, drawn toward the heart of the town, the place where everything seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. I wasn't sure what was worse, the water that had tried to consume me or this unnerving stillness that clung to every corner, like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see Claire. But there was no one. The street was empty, save for the remnants of a life that didn't seem to belong. A bicycle tipped over on the sidewalk. A cat's collar, left behind as it dropped hastily, the bells still faintly jingling in the stillness. I could almost hear the distant hum of voices, but they were muffled, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The town stretched out before me, vast and silent, as if the water had submerged it not just physically but emotionally as well. There was no sign of life, no people, no movement. Yet it all felt so alive. Alive in a way that was unnatural. I pressed on, drawn by something I couldn't understand, something that whispered to me from the depths of my mind. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I needed to find answers. I had to figure out what was happening, or I might lose myself entirely, become just another shadow in a place that no longer existed. Turning the corner, I came upon the town's main square. The fountain in the center had dried up, the stone basin cracked and broken, but the water that had nearly consumed me, was still there. It shimmered with a strange, liquid light, rippling gently as though it were breathing. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the fountain, their back turned to me. The figure was draped in a long coat, their features obscured by the dim light. They didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence, yet I knew, somehow, that they were waiting for me. I hesitated, but something pushed me forward, some unseen force compelling me to approach. The closer I got, the more I could feel it, a hum, a vibration in the air that mirrored the same hum I had felt earlier, before the water had overtaken me. It was the same sound that had echoed in my chest, resonating through my bones. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unsteady, unsure. The figure turned, slowly, as if it were something mechanical, like a clock unwinding its gears. And when their face came into view, I froze. It wasn't Claire. It wasn't anyone I knew. The person standing before me had eyes, deep, black eyes that reflected nothing but endless void. Their face was featureless, smooth, as if they had been carved from stone. There was no emotion, no expression, only an overwhelming sense of dread that seeped from their very being, clinging to the air like an invisible fog. They opened their mouth, but no sound came. Instead, the ground beneath my feet trembled, and the air thickened. "You should have never come here." The voice was not human. It was the sound of the water, of the silence, of the town itself. It spoke from within me, as if the words were not spoken aloud but directly into my mind. I staggered back, heart hammering in my chest. What is this? What is happening to this place? The figure raised its hand, and I followed its gesture. Behind it, the town flickered like a dying film reel, and for a moment, I saw another version of Bellefontaine. The streets were alive again, bustling with people, the sounds of their voices mingling with the scent of food, laughter, and life. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by the dead, silent version of the town I stood in now. "It's not real," the figure whispered, the words now vibrating through the air itself. "This town, these people, they never were. It is a place caught between worlds, a memory trapped in time. And now, it is yours." I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, what I was seeing. "I don't understand. Why me? Why this town?" The figure's eyes flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of recognition, a memory, perhaps, of someone I had known, someone I had lost. But just as quickly, the moment passed, and it was replaced with an overwhelming, crushing silence. "Because you're part of it," the figure said softly. "You always have been." A cold wind swept through the square, swirling around me like the pull of the water, dragging me in, dragging me down. Suddenly, the town seemed to change again. The buildings stretched, warped, and bent like something out of a nightmare. The streets twisted unnaturally, the sky darkening, filled with clouds that churned and writhed. I reached out, trying to hold onto something, anything, but my hands slipped through empty air. I was falling, spiraling into the unknown. The figure's voice echoed behind me, fading into the distance as I was pulled deeper into the abyss. "You've always been a part of it," it said, the words growing fainter. "And now, you'll never leave." I woke up with a gasp, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought I had drowned, that the water had finally claimed me. But the room around me was dim, still, and quiet. I sat up, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of the nightmare. But as I looked around, something caught my eye, a shadow in the corner of the room, a flicker of movement that shouldn't have been there. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Only the empty room, the silence, and the water that had never really left. The world around me felt wrong. The nightmare hadn't ended. The figure, the voices, the water, they lingered, haunting every corner of my mind. I had awoken, but I wasn't sure if I was truly awake. I didn't know where the dream ended and the real world began anymore. I slowly stood, my legs unsteady, as if the very act of moving was an intrusion into this strange new reality. My pulse hammered in my chest, each beat a sharp reminder of my mortality. But the emptiness surrounding me, the silence, was more than just unsettling. It was suffocating, as if the world itself had drawn its last breath. I stumbled toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The town still loomed there, the same as it had when I arrived. Bellefontaine, its streets, its buildings, were just as silent, just as empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that there was something beyond the ordinary in the town's stillness. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the street. Its shape was unclear, obscured by the faint mist that clung to the town. It wasn't moving, but I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the same figure from the square, but something was eerily familiar about it. I turned away from the window, the weight of the sight pressing heavily on me. I couldn't just stay here, couldn't allow myself to be consumed by this place any longer. But where could I go? I quickly grabbed my jacket, heading for the door. The weight of the silence wrapped itself around me, thick and suffocating. Each step I took felt like a betrayal of the world I knew, as though I was stepping further into something unnatural, something beyond explanation. The door creaked open with a slow, grinding sound. As I stepped outside, the chill of the morning air hit me like a slap to the face, grounding me in the moment. The mist clung to the streets like a heavy blanket, distorting everything I saw. The town, though still and abandoned, felt more alive. Like it was waiting for something, or someone. I moved cautiously down the street, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The figure I had seen through the window was gone, but I felt its presence, like a shadow hovering just beyond my vision. Every alley I passed seemed to stretch on too long, every building too still, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to make my next move. As I approached the center of town, something shifted. The air grew thick, as if it were thickening with pressure, pressing against me, pushing me toward the fountain. It was the same fountain from the square, now eerily familiar. The stone basin still cracked, the water still absent, but there was something else. A faint shimmer hovered above the stone, like a heat mirage rising from the surface. I stood there, staring at the fountain, feeling the pull. The town seemed to stretch, to twist around me, as if trying to force me into some grand, unknown design. I wanted to run, to escape, but the pull was too strong. There was something I needed to understand. Something here that was beyond me, beyond logic. Something that had been buried in the depths of my mind since I first set foot in Bellefontaine. The murmur of voices returned, faint and far off, like the soft lapping of water against a distant shore. The voices weren't clear, but I could feel them, feel their words pulling at my consciousness, as if they were trying to wake me from a dream I couldn't remember. I moved closer to the fountain, the mist swirling around me, tightening like a noose. As I reached the edge of the stone basin, the shimmering light above it began to pulse, the reflection of the sky above warping and flickering. And then, as though the town itself had finally come alive, the water that had almost consumed me, began to rise. Slowly at first, creeping up the sides of the fountain, then faster, as though it were eager to reach me, to swallow me whole. The air hummed with that familiar vibration, deep and resonant. I stepped back in shock, my heart pounding, but I couldn't move away. The water was growing, pushing against me, creeping toward me like an unstoppable force. The figure from earlier, now standing just at the edge of my vision, watching, seemed to smile, though its face remained a blur. "It's not real," the voice echoed again, the same voice from before. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, filling the air with its dark promise. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, but I couldn't look away from the rising water. It was too late now to escape. The town, the water, the strange force pulling me into this place, it was all becoming one. There was no distinction between the streets, the sky, the people who had once lived here. They were all tied together in this endless loop. The water surged, spilling over the sides of the fountain, rushing toward me, filling the square with an overwhelming roar. It rose faster than I could process, and for the first time since I had arrived, I understood the truth. This wasn't a town that had vanished. This was a town that never truly existed. Not in the way I had thought. Not in the way any of us had thought. The water was more than just water. It was time. It was memory. It was a reflection of what was, what could have been, and what never would be. It wasn't just swallowing the town. It was swallowing me. I stood frozen as the water reached my ankles, then my knees. It didn't feel cold, it felt familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting for me to acknowledge it. "You've always been a part of it," the figure whispered again, and this time I couldn't deny it. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a truth. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the water rise higher, submerging me in its endless depths. The water enveloped me completely, and I was swallowed by the dark, oppressive depth. I felt no panic, no urge to struggle. The current didn't pull, it merely surrounded, as though the flood was something I had always known, something I had always been part of. I tried to open my eyes, but all I saw was a swirling abyss. The town, the figures, the voices, everything that had haunted me seemed to dissolve into a mass of rippling memories stretching beyond my comprehension. Time, space, reality, all of it was in flux. A voice called to me, familiar yet distant. You knew this was coming. It wasn't spoken aloud, it resonated deep within me, as though it came from the water itself, from the very earth that had once been solid beneath my feet. I felt the words in my bones, in my heart. They were true, undeniable. This, everything, had always been inevitable. I had seen it before, hadn't I? I had seen the city sink beneath the water. I had seen the mist, the figures. I had seen my own face, staring back at me from the reflections of the past and the future. But I had never truly understood. You were always part of it. You will always return. I wanted to scream, to break free from the overwhelming force of the water, but it wasn't physical. The water wasn't just drowning me, it was erasing me. It was erasing everything that I had once known. The flood was not just an element, it was an endless cycle, repeating itself, drawing the town, its people, back into its grasp again and again. The figures rose from the depths. Faces, blurred and twisted, but familiar. They reached for me, their eyes empty, their lips forming words I could no longer hear. We are you. Suddenly, the water began to recede, but not in the way I had hoped. It didn't return to the fountain, it drained away from the town, leaving behind the same empty streets I had wandered earlier. But now they were more than silent. They were abandoned, broken. A memory of a place that no longer existed. I staggered, disoriented, as the sound of my footsteps echoed through the hollow town. It was a town that had never truly existed, but one that would never leave me. Its pull was now a part of me, a thread I couldn't escape. I looked around, but the mist had thickened again, and the figures, those who had once been real, were nowhere to be seen. The town had erased them, just as it had erased itself. All that remained was a place suspended in time, neither past nor future, neither real nor unreal. I was alone. Or was I? I felt it before I saw it, the weight of a presence, hovering just out of sight. A shadow, familiar yet foreign. The figure from the square, the one that had always watched, its face obscured. It was here, standing at the edge of the square, waiting for me. It did not speak, but its presence was enough. I knew it knew me. We were tied together, forever linked by the fate of this place. I had been consumed by it, and I would never be free. The figure stepped forward, its form slowly becoming clearer in the mist. It was tall, draped in a cloak of shadows that shifted like the waves of the water itself. As it moved closer, I felt the air around me grow colder, heavier. A familiar, unbearable pressure. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet were glued to the ground. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I had never been able to. You should have known, the figure whispered, its voice no longer distant. Now it was inside my head, inside my heart. I understood now. I had always known. The town, the water, the figures, they were not separate from me. They were a part of me. And the cycle would never end. The flood would return, and the town would disappear again, only to rise once more. Each time, I would be there, each time a new iteration of the same impossible truth. You will never leave, the figure murmured. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. I tried to move, tried to tear myself away from the inevitable pull, but the figure reached out, its hand cold as ice. As it touched my shoulder, I felt the water surge again, as if the ocean had claimed me once more. The town, the city, everything around me blurred into a maelstrom of memory and time, and I was pulled under. I was lost. The last thing I heard, before the darkness fully consumed me, was the voice. You were never meant to escape. And then, the water closed in. The town was gone. For now. Cold winds. I didn't think much of the chill at first. Just a change in the wind, the kind of breeze that sweeps across the plains in New Mexico. I'd lived here my whole life, and the weather, odd as it could be, was never anything I couldn't explain away. But this was different. There was something in the air, something that felt unnatural. It wasn't just cold, it was an invasive cold. The kind of cold that crawls beneath your skin and sinks into your bones. I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my small house, the kettle whistling in the kitchen as I tried to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. The wind howled outside, a sharp, biting gust that rattled the windows. But it wasn't just the strength of it, it was the way it seemed to come from every direction at once. It was wrong. I lived in a small town outside Santa Fe, a place where the sun usually blazes and the dry air keeps most things at bay. Even when the occasional storm rolls in, it's always been brief, a few moments of rain, a couple of thunderclaps, and then back to the dusty heat. But not this time. This wasn't a normal storm. The first person to disappear was Greg. He was an old friend of mine, someone I'd known since we were kids. Greg was a man of routine, always up before dawn, always checking the weather before heading out for his daily walk. That morning, he didn't show up at his usual spot at the diner, not even to grab his coffee. I thought maybe he just had a late night, or maybe the cold had kept him in bed longer than usual. But then the wind picked up, and the town began to feel emptier, as if something was pulling people away. I hadn't heard from Greg for days, not until his wife came to my door one evening, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Have you seen him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's gone." I didn't know what to say. I thought maybe he'd just taken off, gone to the mountains for some solitude, as he often did. But I couldn't explain the way her words hung in the air, heavy and unnerving. As the days passed, the wind grew colder, sharper, like a knife dragging through the fabric of the sky. It howled every night, shaking the windows of the houses, rattling the doors. People started disappearing, one by one. First Greg, then the Andersons, and then someone else. They were always found near the outskirts of town, gone without a trace, like the wind had swept them away. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know why it was happening. I tried to explain it away, maybe a storm, maybe some freak weather pattern, maybe anything but the reality that was staring me in the face. People were vanishing, but no one knew why. The chill wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside, too. Inside me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, shivering, even though the house was warm. My breath would come out in clouds, and I'd hear the wind. No, it wasn't just the wind, it was something else, something too deep to explain, something alive. And then, the shadows started to move. It started with the old willow tree in Greg's yard. I had passed by it 100 times, but that night, something about it looked wrong. The tree wasn't moving, but the shadows around it were. The moonlight barely touched the ground, and the darkness beneath the branches seemed to stretch further than it should have. It felt like it was watching me, like it knew what was coming. I wanted to leave, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The wind was everywhere. It had already started to claim the town, one person at a time. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a storm. It wasn't just the wind. This cold, this unnatural cold, it had a purpose. It was coming for all of us, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. I stood by the window, staring out into the night, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The wind howled, and somewhere, in the distance, I thought I heard a voice. A voice that wasn't human. A voice that called my name. Was it just the wind? Or was it something else? Something that wanted me next? I didn't know. And that was what terrified me the most. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest like a stone. But the wind, it just wouldn't stop. It whipped through the streets in a constant, relentless howl, a sound that gnawed at my sanity. I spent most of the morning pacing around my house, checking the windows, the doors, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. But it was no use, the air itself felt heavy, oppressive. I thought I heard a knock at the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. Just the wind, pushing against me as if it had a mind of its own. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened. People had started whispering about strange occurrences. A few nights before, Mrs. Howard, who lived 3 blocks down, had sworn she saw something in her backyard. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but then she saw the figure move. She said it was tall, shadowy, and shrouded in the mist that the wind brought. It didn't belong to any of the townspeople. And when she blinked, it was gone. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't want to believe it, but the cold was growing stronger. I could feel it in the very air. The chill wasn't just outside anymore, it had seeped into my bones. It made my joints ache and my skin tingle. I couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. Every time the wind gusted, I felt as though something was brushing against my face, the cold like fingers running down my spine. I took a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The streets were eerily quiet, no children playing, no cars driving by, not even the usual chatter from the corner store. It was like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. As I walked past Greg's house, I glanced at the front yard. The willow tree stood still, but the shadow beneath it had stretched even further. It was as though it was trying to pull me in, calling me. I shuddered and looked away, quickening my pace. That evening, I decided to check on Mrs. Howard. The whispers about the figure in her yard had been on my mind all day. I wanted to see if she was all right, if anyone was. Her house was small, but warm, nestled between two larger homes. When I knocked, she opened the door, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide, almost panicked. She invited me in without a word, and as soon as I stepped through the door, I felt it. The temperature had dropped. The fire in her fireplace was almost out, and yet the room had a chill to it, a biting cold that made my breath fog in front of me. "What's going on, Mrs. Howard?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "I heard you saw something last night." Her eyes darted to the window, then back to me. "It's not just the wind," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought I was losing my mind, but I swear it wasn't just the wind. It was something else. It's been getting colder every day, and the shadows, they're moving. "Shadows?" I echoed, feeling a shiver crawl up my neck. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the far corner of the room. "I saw something last night. Something tall. It was just standing there. And then I blinked, and it was gone. But I swear, I heard it whispering. It called my name." I froze. "It called your name?" Mrs. Howard nodded again. "Not just mine. Everyone's." I could hear the voices in the wind, but they weren't just the wind. They were people. People who had disappeared. Greg, the Andersons, they were all there. Calling to me. I felt my pulse quicken. I had to get out of there. The chill in the room was suffocating, and her words were starting to crawl under my skin like the wind itself. The longer I stayed, the more I felt it, something in the air, pressing in from all sides, threatening to close in around us. I think you need to leave," Mrs. Howard said suddenly, her voice shaky. "It's not safe here. None of us are safe." Before I could ask what she meant, there was a sound, a sharp, eerie howl that pierced the air, coming from the distance. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something that carried a weight of malice. Something that seemed to be calling us. I turned to Mrs. Howard, my heart pounding in my chest. Her face had drained of color, her lips trembling. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I nodded slowly, unable to form words. "Run," she said. "Run, before it's too late." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and bolted for the door, the wind howling louder now, as if it was alive, chasing me. The cold bit into my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every part of me screamed that I had to get away. As I ran down the street, the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me like hands reaching from the dark. I heard the whispering again, soft at first, and then louder, clearer, as though the wind itself was speaking. "Come closer," the voice said, and I froze in my tracks. I wanted to look back. I wanted to see what it was, but I couldn't. My legs were rooted to the spot, my body cold and trembling. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to move, to run. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The wind was closing in, and I was afraid it would take me next. I don't know how long I ran. The world around me had blurred into a mass of sound and motion. The wind was everywhere, a constant force that gnawed at my skin and stole my breath. It howled and moaned, like a pack of wolves prowling just beyond the reach of my vision. The night felt endless, and with every step, it felt like the shadows were getting closer. The fear clawed at me, urging me to run faster, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The streets were deserted, and the houses loomed around me like hollow, soulless things. Not a single light flickered in any of the windows. The entire town seemed to have been swallowed by the cold and the silence. My heart hammered in my chest as I passed the old diner on the corner, the one that used to be a gathering spot for anyone in town with a story to tell. Now, the windows were dark, the door ajar. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should go inside, but the wind pushed against me, urging me forward. It was then that I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the street, outlined by the pale light of the moon. The wind seemed to pause for a split second, and for that brief moment, everything was still. The figure didn't move. I froze. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. Tall, thin, and draped in shadows that shifted with the wind. I could feel its presence even though I couldn't see its face. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air seemed to hum with some unseen power, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. I took a tentative step forward, but before I could make another move, the figure vanished. I blinked, and it was gone. But the wind didn't stop. It kept pushing me, urging me forward, like a force trying to drag me deeper into the heart of the storm. I could hear something now, a whisper that wasn't carried by the wind. It was too clear, too deliberate. Words. Names. My name. But it wasn't just my name. I could hear others too, voices of people who had disappeared over the past few days. Greg. Mrs. Howard. The Andersons. They were calling to me, but not in a way that comforted me. No, this wasn't a plea for help. It was something darker, something colder. I kept running, the sound of my footfalls muffled by the growing howls of the wind. The streets seemed to stretch on forever, but the town didn't feel like the one I had grown up in. It felt alien, like a place out of time, a place where something had gone wrong and everything had been forgotten. I rounded a corner and nearly ran into a figure standing in the middle of the road. A woman. Her hair was tangled, wild, and her eyes were wide with a panic that mirrored my own. She looked at me as though she knew I had been running, knew what I had been hearing. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but all that came out was a ragged breath, followed by a whispered name. Eva. I stopped short, my heart skipping a beat. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. But as she took another step toward me, the wind around us shifted, swirling violently. I could see her face now, pale and gaunt, her skin drawn tight over the bones of her skull. Her lips trembled as she reached toward me, her fingers outstretched. Eva, you have to go, she whispered again, her voice strained and distant, as though it wasn't entirely hers. They're coming for you. They're coming for all of us. I wanted to run. I wanted to get away from her, from whatever had happened to her, but something held me in place. It was the look in her eyes, something desperate, something pleading. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't just a shadow. She wasn't gone. Not yet. But her warning came too late. The wind howled again, louder this time, and I could feel it pulling at my very soul. It seemed to take shape, to twist and writhe around us like a living thing. I turned away from her, eyes wide in terror, and tried to move, but my legs were frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could hear voices calling out to me now, familiar voices that shouldn't be there. They were everywhere, on the wind, in the cracks between the walls, in the darkness. The very air seemed to vibrate with the sound of their names. It was as though the wind had become a conduit, a way for the dead to reach through from whatever place they had been taken. I could feel it now, the wind, the cold. It wasn't just weather. It was something alive, something that had a purpose. Something that was using the wind to tear us apart, to drag us into a place where there was no escape. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned to face the woman again. But she was gone. Vanished, swallowed by the wind, as if she had never been there at all. I wasn't alone, but I couldn't tell if anyone was still real. I stumbled backward, trying to breathe, trying to think. But every step I took felt like I was being pulled farther into the storm. The shadows were closing in. And then, suddenly, there was a deafening silence. A silence so complete, so terrifying, that it made my heart stop. And in that silence, a new sound came, a low, unearthly hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. The wind had stopped, but the hum, the sound, it was still there. It surrounded me, and I knew, without a doubt, that something was coming. I just didn't know how much longer I could survive the storm. I thought I had heard the worst of it, the howling winds, the whispers of those long gone, the eerie hum in the air. But the silence that followed was worse. It swallowed everything. I could no longer hear the wind, no longer feel the sting of the cold biting in my skin. It was as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something far worse to unfold. The street was empty, and yet I could feel eyes on me. Not from the shadows or the houses, but from the air itself. The hum still lingered, like a pulse beneath my skin, pushing against me, filling my ears, my mind, my very soul. It was maddening, this silence, but not the kind that comforts you. No, this silence pressed in from all sides, as though the very essence of the world had been sucked away, leaving only this unbearable tension behind. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The world felt wrong, unnatural, as though the rules had suddenly changed and nothing made sense anymore. Then, just as I thought I might collapse under the weight of it, I heard it, a crack, sharp and sudden, like the sound of ice breaking underfoot. And then another, and another. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, tremble, as though something was moving underneath. I turned, my breath shallow, hoping to see something, anything, that made sense. But there was nothing. The street remained the same, still, lifeless, and cold. And yet, the cracking continued, louder now, like the sound of bones snapping. The buildings, the pavement, even the trees, everything was creaking, straining under some unseen pressure. And then I saw it. A ripple in the air, a distortion, like a darkening of the light. It spread across the street, moving toward me like a wave, an unnatural shadow with a depth that seemed to reach into the very fabric of the world. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was this? What was happening? The shadow moved closer, and I felt it. A tug, like an invisible hand pulling me toward it. The hum intensified, vibrating in my chest now, a low, guttural sound that seemed to match the rhythm of my heart. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was closing in on me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs refused to obey. It was as though the earth itself had become a trap, and no matter how hard I tried, I was stuck in place, a fly caught in a web of frozen time. And then I saw them. Figures, emerging from the shadows, their shapes indistinct, blurred like smoke. They moved in perfect unison, their forms flickering in and out of existence, as though they weren't fully part of the world. I couldn't make out their faces, there was nothing human about them. Their eyes, if they had any, were hollow, empty voids. I could feel their presence now, more strongly than ever before. They weren't just in front of me, they were inside me, twisting my thoughts, my memories. I tried to push them away, to think of something else, anything else, but their influence was overwhelming. Their names filled my mind, whispered in the same voice that had called to me before. I could hear my own name, too, repeated over and over, but it didn't sound like me anymore. It was as though the wind itself had become my voice, and it was calling me towards something I couldn't understand. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my mouth wouldn't open. I wanted to run, to escape from the cold and the shadows, but I was paralyzed, frozen in place. The figures were closer now, their forms more distinct, but still so unnatural, so wrong. They were no longer moving in unison. They were moving toward me individually, their limbs jerking, twitching, as though they were puppets controlled by strings I couldn't see. One of them reached out toward me, its fingers elongated and skeletal, its touch so cold that I could feel it in my bones. "Eva," it whispered, its voice like the scraping of ice. "You're not meant to be here." I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. All I knew was that these things were not human, and whatever they were not good. I managed to break free, just for a second. I ran, my feet stumbling over the cracked pavement. My breath came in sharp gasps, each one colder than the last. The figures didn't follow, they didn't need to. The wind was already there, rising again, pulling me back, filling my lungs with ice. I reached the edge of the town, where the houses gave way to the open desert. The wind whipped through the barren landscape, carrying with it a chill that seeped into my very soul. I could still hear their whispers, still feel their presence, even as the town receded into the distance. But it wasn't over. Not yet. I stopped, turning to face the vast emptiness of the desert. The wind, once again, howled. And in that howling, I heard something else, something deeper, something far worse. The hum was growing louder. It was a sound I couldn't escape, a sound that felt as though it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And in the distance, beyond the horizon, I saw it. A dark mass, twisting, shifting, like the very sky itself was being consumed. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was coming, and there was nowhere to hide. The wind was alive, and it was taking everything. Everything and everyone. I stood there in the barren desert, the wind howling like a beast on the prowl, every gust tearing at my skin, biting into my bones. The sky above was a roiling mass of dark clouds, swirling and shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible. It was as if the earth itself had cracked open, revealing something ancient, something terrible beneath. The hum, that incessant, maddening sound, filled the air once more, louder now, like the entire world was vibrating with it. I felt it, the pull, the pressure in the air, the suffocating weight of something vast and unknowable moving toward me. I knew it was too late to run. Whatever this was, it had already found me. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. The figures from the town, those twisted shadows, had faded from my sight, but their presence lingered in the air, like a shadow over my very soul. The wind carried their voices, low, whispering, a chorus of warnings and threats. Eva, the wind carried my name again, but it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was everywhere, wrapping around me, suffocating me. Eva, you can't escape. You can't hide from the cold. The words pierced through me, dragging my thoughts into a haze. I tried to shake them off, to focus on what was real, but the reality around me was crumbling, turning to something alien. The desert, once so still and empty, was now alive, shifting beneath my feet, the sand swirling in unnatural patterns, the very ground trembling with the force of the coming storm. I turned back to face the horizon, my heart racing in my chest, my breath shallow and ragged. I could see it now, the mass in the distance, the darkness swallowing the sky, an endless void that stretched from the earth to the heavens. It moved toward me, faster now, its edges flickering with a cold light, like the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. I stumbled back, my body screaming for me to run, but my legs refused to move. The wind was too strong now, pushing against me, pulling me closer to the heart of the storm. I could feel it, something pulling at me, dragging me toward the darkness. The air was so cold, it felt like it was freezing my very soul. I looked around, desperate for some sign of escape, but there was nothing. No one. The desert stretched out endlessly, a vast, empty void. The storm, the wind, the hum, they were all closing in on me, swallowing everything. There was no refuge. No way to outrun it. I heard it again, the whispering voices, now louder, more insistent. Eva, you are not meant to survive this. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The darkness was inside me now, filling my mind, twisting my thoughts. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The storm, the cold, the voices, they were all becoming one. A force so powerful, so ancient, that it had no need to explain itself. It simply was. I reached out, grasping at the air, as if trying to hold on to something, anything. But there was nothing. The wind tore through me, its icy grip pulling me toward the center of the storm. And then, just as it seemed like all hope was lost, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder, more distinct. The sound of footsteps. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. Someone else? Had they come to help? I turned, my mind racing, hoping against hope that it was a person, a sign that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing. Except for the shadows. Figures, tall and hunched, their forms shifting in the wind. They were walking toward me, their movements slow and deliberate. The same figures from the town. The same cold, hollow eyes. They were here. You should have known, Eva, one of them said, its voice like the cracking of ice. You can't escape what's coming. No one can. I opened my mouth to scream, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. The wind had silenced me, and the figures were already too close, their hands reaching out, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. The world spun, and I felt my body lifting off the ground, as if the wind itself was taking me. My feet left the desert, and I was floating, suspended in the air, surrounded by the darkness and the cold. The hum intensified, now a deafening roar in my ears, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. The wind howled, louder than I'd ever heard it before, and I realized with a chilling certainty that I was no longer in control of my own body. I was being taken by the storm, taken by the cold, taken by the darkness. And then, as the last of the warmth left my body, as the wind consumed me entirely, I understood. This was no natural storm. No, it was something far worse, something older than time itself. It was a force that could not be reasoned with, that could not be outrun. It didn't want to kill me. It didn't need to. It simply wanted to take me, like everything else. And in the end, it would leave nothing but emptiness. A final breath. A final thought. And then nothing. The wind stopped. And I was gone. Rare shadow. It began on a quiet evening, one of those crisp autumn nights in Colorado when the air is sharp and clear, and the sun sets with a golden warmth that quickly fades into the cold blue of twilight. I had always thought there was something almost magical about this place, the mountains looming in the distance, the ever-present whisper of wind between the trees. But tonight, something felt wrong. I was alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. My wife, Emily, was upstairs, and our son, Jack, was in his room, as usual, his nose buried in some book or another. The house was peaceful, almost eerily so, but there was a slight chill in the air that seemed out of place for the season. I glanced at the window, a reflection catching my eye. But it wasn't my own reflection, not entirely. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light or the angle of the kitchen lights, but when I looked again, it was unmistakable, a shadow, but not a shadow from me, from anyone in the room. It was just there. It moved in the corner of my vision, an unnatural distortion, like it was watching me, waiting for something. I froze. The knife in my hand felt heavier, the kitchen seemed to shrink around me. A shiver ran down my spine as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The shadow wasn't right. It wasn't supposed to be there. For a moment, I considered calling out to Emily, asking if she had seen it too, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. What would I even say? I wasn't sure if I even believed what I had seen. I turned away from the window, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. But as I did, I caught a glimpse of it again, a fleeting movement, darker than the shadows around it. It didn't match the natural light or the shifting angles of the room. It moved when I moved, like it was tied to me, tethered to my every motion. It was only then that I realized this shadow was following me. The realization was chilling. The air felt heavier, the room colder. I could almost hear it, this thing that wasn't supposed to be there, whispering just beyond my reach. Was it in my mind? Or was there something truly wrong with this house, something I hadn't noticed until now? The shadow shifted again, following my movements exactly. It wasn't mimicking me, it was a mirror. A reflection of something deeper, darker within me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was being watched by something far older, far more powerful than any natural force. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. It had to be my imagination. I had to stop being so paranoid. Maybe it was just the dimming light, the way the shadows had lengthened as the day faded. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself of this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Emily?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Jack?" There was no answer. I took a step toward the hallway, my eyes flicking back to the corner of the kitchen where the shadow lingered, waiting. My heart beat faster, my breath shallow. What was it? Why did it feel like it was getting closer? I stepped into the hallway, the house eerily silent. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I walked cautiously toward the staircase, the quiet weight of the house pressing down on me. I could feel the shadow following me, never out of sight, always there, just at the edge of my perception. Emily. I called again, this time louder, more desperate. But there was still no answer. The house felt empty, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I turned the corner toward the stairs, but stopped short. The shadow was there, at the top of the stairs. It stretched unnaturally, almost like it was growing, spreading, not confined to the shape it should be. It seemed to pulse, like it was breathing, alive in a way I couldn't understand. And then, I heard a sound, a whisper, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Come closer. It was Emily's voice. But it was wrong. It sounded distant, distorted, as though coming from the very depths of the shadow itself. I didn't move. My legs felt frozen, like the weight of the shadow had reached out and wrapped around me, pinning me in place. Emily? My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The shadow quivered, its edges flickering like a flame on the verge of dying. And then, with an unnatural movement, it moved toward me, sliding down the walls, inching closer, its form becoming more defined. I could feel it. Something inside me, the darkest parts, the hidden fears, the things I kept buried, stirred, rising in response. The shadow was pulling them out, showing them to me in ways I couldn't ignore. It was as if it was feeding on my doubts, my guilt, my deepest regrets. My pulse quickened. I had to get to Emily. I had to protect her. But when I turned to run, I realized I couldn't move fast enough. The shadow was too close, too powerful. I could hear its whispers now, clearer than ever, echoing through my mind. Come closer, closer, to see the truth. And then it dawned on me, the shadow wasn't just following me. It was me. It was a part of me. The dark thoughts, the fears, the things I had buried, it was all coming to light. But what would it do once it was free? It was only the beginning. The beginning of something that, if I didn't stop it now, would consume everything. I didn't understand. How could a shadow, something so simple, so benign, turn into something so horrifying? It was as though I had crossed some invisible line, and now there was no going back. The air was thick, suffocating, as I stood frozen in the hallway. My legs trembled, and my heartbeat thundered in my chest. Each breath I took felt colder, as though the very atmosphere was being drained of warmth. I could feel it now, the weight of the shadow pressing down on me, tugging at the edges of my mind, at my very thoughts. I tried to shake it off, tried to make sense of what was happening, but all logic seemed to slip away, like water through my fingers. The house was silent, but in that silence, I could feel it. The presence that wasn't supposed to be here, creeping just out of sight, watching. Emily? Jack? I whispered again, but my voice sounded distant, as though it wasn't my own. It didn't carry the urgency I meant it to. I could hear nothing in response, only the quiet whisper of the wind outside and the slow creak of the house settling, but there was something else, too. A distant echo of something, like footsteps on the stairs. The floorboards groaning under an unseen weight. I stepped forward, my legs stiff and hesitant, inching my way toward the staircase. The shadow had receded slightly, but was still there, hovering, pulsating in the dim light, as if alive, waiting for me to make the next move. Every part of me screamed to turn and run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't obey. At the foot of the stairs, I hesitated. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, came again. I clenched my fists, my palms slick with sweat. Was it Emily? Was it Jack? I took a step up, then another, and then I froze again. There, at the top of the stairs, standing motionless in the dark hallway, was Emily. But something was wrong. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. Her back was turned, her silhouette bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. But it was not just her stillness that disturbed me. It was the way the shadow changed. It clung to her, twisting around her feet, wrapping itself tightly around her legs, pulling up her body, encircling her form like a dark embrace. I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. This thing wasn't her. I was looking at her, but the shadow had taken hold. It was as though it had become her. And with that realization, the fear gnawed deeper at me, clawing at the edges of my sanity. Emily? I whispered, my voice barely audible, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile calm of the moment. Her head turned slowly, just enough for me to see her face. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally so, and there was a dull, glassy quality to them, like she wasn't seeing me at all, like she wasn't seeing anything at all. Her lips barely parted, and a low, broken whisper slipped from them. Come closer. It was her voice, but it was warped, distant, like it had traveled through 1,000 miles of nothingness. The shadow, now fully surrounding her, seemed to ripple, moving like liquid blackness, like it was searching, hungry. And then, it began to move again, toward me. The sound it made was unmistakable, like the air itself was being drawn into a vacuum, an eerie hum that filled the silence of the house. I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place, my breath coming shallow, too fast. The cold crept deeper into my bones. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand here, not like this. I tried to think, to remember something, anything that could explain what was happening. But my mind was a blur, the thoughts swimming in chaotic circles, none of them making sense. The shadow shifted again, and this time it was more than just a reflection of the room. It had shape, it had form, and now it was real. I saw it, felt it pressing against me, a weight in the air. The deeper I looked into the darkness, the more it seemed to shift, to become something else entirely. Something more dangerous. More insidious. It wasn't just following me, it was controlling me. I tried to call out, to scream, but no sound came. The house was alive now, humming with an energy I didn't understand. I had always thought that the house, the land, was beautiful, serene, but now it felt suffocating, like a trap. And I, the one who had always believed I was safe, was nothing more than a pawn in this game. The shadow lunged, its tendrils of darkness reaching for me, wrapping around my body. I gasped, struggling against its grip, but it was too strong. I could feel it pulling me toward the stairs, toward Emily, toward the heart of the darkness that had settled into this house. I closed my eyes, my mind screaming for escape. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Shadows didn't live. They didn't control. They didn't. But as I opened my eyes, I saw her. Emily. She was standing there, right in front of me now. But it wasn't her. Not anymore. The shadow had consumed her, and now it wore her face like a mask. Come closer, she whispered again, but this time the voice was not hers. It was the shadow speaking through her. And with that final whisper, the air around me seemed to shift. The room began to pulse, each beat pulling me deeper into the blackness, into the endless depths of something I could no longer fight. I was falling into the shadow. And as I descended, I realized the horrible truth: there was no escape. I woke up with a start, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. My head spun as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The coldness, the suffocating air, the shadows closing in, it was all too real. But no, it had to be a dream. It had to be. How else could I explain what I'd just seen? But the feeling lingered, like a stain that wouldn't wash away. I looked around the room, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real. But as I glanced toward the corner of the room, the familiar sight of the darkened corner of the ceiling sent a shiver down my spine. The shadow was there. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. I didn't know how, but I felt it, creeping along the edges of the room, just waiting to move. My body tensed, my skin prickled, and my thoughts began to race again. I could feel the air grow colder, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but my voice felt trapped in my throat, like I wasn't in control of my own body anymore. It was as if the shadow had taken a part of me, like it was slowly eroding my mind, one thought at a time. I stood up shakily, the weight of my legs feeling unnatural. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But no matter where I looked, no matter which direction I turned, the shadow was always there, lurking just outside of my vision, creeping closer every second. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, but as my hand reached for the doorknob, the world around me shifted. The room seemed to stretch and warp, the edges bending and distorting in ways that made my stomach churn. The floor felt uneven beneath my feet, like I was standing on the edge of some abyss. No, no, no! I muttered, backing away from the door, my breathing quickening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the sound deafening in the stillness of the room. The door wouldn't open. I pulled harder, twisting the knob, slamming my shoulder against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to pulse now, vibrating with a strange energy, and I could hear it, the faint, whispering laughter, as though the house itself was alive. The shadow had me. It had me trapped here, in this place where reality bent and twisted beyond recognition. Then, I heard the footsteps again, soft, slow, deliberate. Not in the hallway this time, but in the room itself, as if someone were moving closer, standing just behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I knew what I would see. I could feel it, the presence growing stronger, closer. The shadow, no longer content with lingering in the corners of the room, had begun to take form again. Slowly, it stretched out, dark tendrils wrapping around the walls, the floor, the ceiling, filling every inch of space. It was as though it was becoming the room itself, consuming everything. And then, it spoke. "Why do you run?" The voice was soft, serpentine, but somehow it echoed, reverberating through my skull. "You can't escape." I turned. I couldn't help it. I had to see it, had to know what was behind the voice. And there it was, standing at the center of the room. The shadow had taken a shape, a distorted reflection of myself, a twisted mockery of my form. The outline of a figure, draped in darkness, but its features were warped, unnatural. The eyes. I couldn't see them clearly. They were just voids, like black holes sucking in all light, all hope. You cannot run from yourself, the shadow said, its voice now splitting into countless fragments, each one filling the room, flooding my mind. You carry me with you. Always. I wanted to scream, to do anything, but my voice was silenced by the sheer weight of its presence. It wasn't just following me anymore. It had become me. It had taken every dark thought, every insecurity, every fear, and turned it into something monstrous. The shadow didn't just reflect me, it was me. I'm not you, I whispered, though it felt weak, like a lie. The words didn't feel right coming out of my mouth. They tasted like dust. Yes, you are, the shadow cooed, its form twitching as if alive. You always have been. My knees buckled. I collapsed to the floor, hands gripping the carpet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to close my eyes, to shut out the terror, but it was useless. The darkness had crawled inside my mind. There was nowhere to hide. Please, I begged, though I didn't know who I was pleading to anymore. Please, just leave me alone. The laughter grew louder, more intense, as if it were mocking me. You can't escape, it whispered again, now close enough that I could feel its breath on my skin. The cold was unbearable, gnawing at me, seeping into my bones. You're already mine. I wanted to fight. I wanted to push back. But what could I do? How could I fight something that was part of me? Suddenly, the shadow moved closer, its form stretching and warping in unnatural ways, reaching out with tendrils that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I screamed, the sound finally breaking free, but it felt like my own voice was swallowed by the darkness. There was no escape. And then, in that moment of pure terror, I realized the terrible truth. The shadow wasn't just after me. It was after my soul. I could feel it now, deep inside of me, a sensation that was both suffocating and freeing at the same time. The shadow wasn't just following me, it wasn't just mimicking me, it had become me. My mind raced in terror, my thoughts scattered like broken glass, shards of panic stabbing at my consciousness. It was everywhere, in every corner of the room, in every dark crevice, every flicker of the lights. The shadow had no face, but somehow I knew it was smiling. The coldness that enveloped me wasn't just physical anymore. It was inside, curling around my heart, making it heavy and slow, like it was sinking into some dark abyss. I wanted to run, to do anything to escape, but my body felt like it was no longer mine to control. Every movement was sluggish, every step felt like I was trudging through thick, invisible mud. And then the voice came again. That cold, slithering voice that had already wormed its way into my mind. You can't run from me, it whispered, the sound vibrating through my very bones. You are me. I wanted to scream, but my voice betrayed me. It was like the shadow had stolen it from me, twisted it into something foreign. Something that wasn't human. I turned toward the mirror, my only hope for some semblance of reality, but the reflection that stared back at me was not my own. It was the shadow, stretching and flickering, its tendrils reaching out, as though it was waiting for permission to consume me completely. What's happening? I whispered, feeling the tears in my eyes as my own face began to distort in the reflection. I'm not like this. I'm not. The shadow in the mirror smiled. It didn't speak, there was no need. The message was clear. You are already mine. I backed away from the mirror, my hands trembling, my chest tight. My breath came out in shallow gasps. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was too much, everything was too much. I was suffocating under the weight of something I couldn't see, something that was inside me, twisting my thoughts, my memories. It was at that moment that I realized this was no longer just a shadow. This was something more, something alive. It had taken root in my mind, feeding on my deepest fears, my insecurities, my darkest thoughts. It had been with me all along, always hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but there was no escape. There was nowhere to go. I was trapped in this nightmare, trapped in my own mind. The air grew colder still, the walls seemed to close in around me, and the shadows stretched longer, deeper, until they consumed everything. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind entirely, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't cold. It wasn't mocking. It was almost comforting. It's okay, it whispered, soothing, almost loving. You don't have to fight anymore. I could feel it then, a gentle tug at my soul, a pull that I couldn't resist. The shadow wasn't just inside me. It was part of me. I was becoming it. The warmth that had filled my body before was gone now, replaced by a void that threatened to swallow me whole. It was like I was floating in space, untethered, drifting, with no sense of who I was or where I was supposed to go. There was only the shadow and the echo of its voice that wrapped itself around my thoughts like a vice. Just let go, the voice said, now softer, almost sweet. You belong to me. I didn't fight it anymore. I couldn't. With every breath, I could feel the shadow sinking deeper into my soul. I was fading. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the reflection of the shadow smiling back at me, its eyes now filled with nothingness, its tendrils wrapping around my body, pulling me into an abyss where there was no light, no escape. And then, there was silence. I could feel it now, deep inside of me, a sensation that was both suffocating and freeing at the same time. The shadow wasn't just following me, it wasn't just mimicking me, it had become me. My mind raced in terror, my thoughts scattered like broken glass, shards of panic stabbing at my consciousness. It was everywhere, in every corner of the room, in every dark crevice, every flicker of the lights. The shadow had no face, but somehow I knew it was smiling. The coldness that enveloped me wasn't just physical anymore. It was inside, curling around my heart, making it heavy and slow, like it was sinking into some dark abyss. I wanted to run, to do anything to escape, but my body felt like it was no longer mine to control. Every movement was sluggish, every step felt like I was trudging through thick, invisible mud. And then the voice came again. That cold, slithering voice that had already wormed its way into my mind. You can't run from me, it whispered, the sound vibrating through my very bones. You are me. I wanted to scream, but my voice betrayed me. It was like the shadow had stolen it from me, twisted it into something foreign. Something that wasn't human. I turned toward the mirror, my only hope for some semblance of reality, but the reflection that stared back at me was not my own. It was the shadow, stretching and flickering, its tendrils reaching out, as though it was waiting for permission to consume me completely. What's happening? I whispered, feeling the tears in my eyes as my own face began to distort in the reflection. I'm not like this. I'm not. The shadow in the mirror smiled. It didn't speak, there was no need. The message was clear. You were already mine. I backed away from the mirror, my hands trembling, my chest tight. My breath came out in shallow gasps. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was too much, everything was too much. I was suffocating under the weight of something I couldn't see, something that was inside me, twisting my thoughts, my memories. It was at that moment that I realized this was no longer just a shadow. This was something more, something alive. It had taken root in my mind, feeding on my deepest fears, my insecurities, my darkest thoughts. It had been with me all along, always hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but there was no escape. There was nowhere to go. I was trapped in this nightmare, trapped in my own mind. The air grew colder still, the walls seemed to close in around me, and the shadows stretched longer, deeper, until they consumed everything. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind entirely, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't cold. It wasn't mocking. It was almost comforting. It's okay, it whispered, soothing, almost loving. You don't have to fight anymore. I could feel it then, a gentle tug at my soul, a pull that I couldn't resist. The shadow wasn't just inside me. It was part of me. I was becoming it. The warmth that had filled my body before was gone now, replaced by a void that threatened to swallow me whole. It was like I was floating in space, untethered, drifting, with no sense of who I was or where I was supposed to go. There was only the shadow, and the echo of its voice that wrapped itself around my thoughts like a vice. Just let go, the voice said, now softer, almost sweet. You belong to me. I didn't fight it anymore. I couldn't. With every breath, I could feel the shadow sinking deeper into my soul. I was fading. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the reflection of the shadow smiling back at me, its eyes now filled with nothingness, its tendrils wrapping around my body, pulling me into an abyss where there was no light, no escape. And then, there was silence. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.